Salam.
Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man tabi'ahu bi ihsanin ila yaumiddin. Amma ba'd. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. The Honorable our research mentor Professor Mansur Ibrahim, Professor Muhammad Nurianto Al-Arif, Deputy Dean, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Islam Negeri Syarif Hidayatullah, Dr. Tika Arundina, Director of Islamic Economics Program at University of Indonesia, other representative from IPB University, maybe Dr. Laili is with us, Secretary of Department of Islamic Economics, and then also from IAEI Jakarta Chapter, Dr. Rahmatina, or the representative, and all participants, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, let us praise Allah the Almighty for His immeasurable grace and blessings upon us. Alhamdulillah, so we can gather virtually in this important occasion. Second, peace be upon the Holy Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the greatest role model of all time for humankind. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very glad that we can meet again this morning here in Indonesia at this international workshop series, session number 4. I would like again to extend our highest gratitude to our research mentor, Professor Mansur Ibrahim, for sparing his time to be with us here, mentoring us to be, inshallah, a good and qualified international researchers. I also would like to thank all the organizers of this event, University of Indonesia, UIN Syarif Hidayatullah, IPB University, and IAEI Jakarta Chapter, as well as my team members from the executive management of KNIKS for making this event happen and inshallah successful. May Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala grant us good health, blessing, and prosperity, and help us in understanding the research mentor given by Professor Mansur today. As you know, we are already in the 4th series today. We will discuss about data and methodology. Therefore, I would like to urge all 73 selected participants to use this opportunity to learn as much as you can from Professor Mansur as our research mentor. And I believe with your full commitment during the session, inshallah, you will be able to grasp knowledge from Professor Mansur. And don't forget to complete all the tasks given by him. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope all of you, especially the participants, 73 selected participants, to be active during the session and gain fruitful knowledge today. That's what I can say. Good luck. I wish you all the best. May Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala bless you all. Thank you very much. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for the opening speech, Dr. Sultan Emir. Ladies and gentlemen, next we will have Prof. Mansur to deliver the workshop. But before that, please let me introduce our mentor today. Prof. Mansur Haji Ibrahim is Professor and Deputy President Academic and Dean at the International Center for Education in Islamic Finance in SIF, Malaysia. He received his PhD in economics in 1996 from Washington University. His areas of interest include monetary or macroeconomic, economic development, financial market analysis, Islamic banking and finance, and applied econometrics. Throughout his academic career, he has published in various scholarly reputable international journals and conducted applied econometric training for various institutions. In 2020, Prof. Mansur Haji Ibrahim was ranked top 2% world as a scientist in the field of economics based on University Stanford related to Scopus citation ranked 2019. He is a guest editor on the World Economic Journal and Pacific Basin Finance Journal, associate editor on Journal Economic Modeling, Scopus H Index International Volume 20. Before the workshop begins, let me inform workshop flow. First, Prof. Mansur will be invited to present the material. After that, there will be a question and answer session and followed by conclusion. Now, allow me to welcome our mentor today, Prof. Mansur Haji Ibrahim, to deliver his workshop. Prof. Mansur, the time is yours.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I hope all of you can listen to me and hopefully this time there will be no distractions like the previous one, because I'm now in my office. So the internet is stronger here. So hopefully the workshop can run smoothly. Okay, Associate Prof. Sultan Emir, Prof. Nurianto Al-Arif, Tika, Dr. Tika, and all others, and all writers. And Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And again, we meet here for the 4th series. Okay? And just to update a little bit regarding the literature review, I have received the write-up from all of you, but less than 20 so far. Okay? So we started with 73, and I received introductions more than 50. And now with literature review, I have less than 20. Hopefully, those of you who have not submitted, please do so, because next week I will give feedback on literature review on Monday, the same times next week. And for those who have submitted, I think the early one, that I have only 3 submissions on the introductions. I already provide feedback for 2, paper number 17, Ahmad, as well as, I forgot the number of paper, but by Budi, both of them, hopefully the feedback that I provided is useful for you to revise back. And one more, I think by, not mistaken, one more, but the one that have given to me is the full paper, right? So I will reserve that full paper to give feedback when all have completed. The idea that I give you to write introduction first and to fill the form, and from that form write introductions, because I would like to see your thought process, right? Because very important, how you put your thought process and how you translate the points into your introductions. Right? And once you give me full paper, very difficult for me to see your thought process, but I will provide feedback. And I think I received less than 20, I'm not sure, 16 or 17 that have given me both introductions and literature review on the 15th, which I'm looking right now, and I will give feedback next week, right? And as I mentioned, hopefully those of you who have not submitted yet, please do so, right? And in fact, from what you have submitted, I see the changes in terms of the structure. At least, basically, I'm pleased to see that all of us can appreciate the structure that we need to put in our introductions. Now, in today's sessions, right, we are going to look at data data and methods, right? Now, when it comes to data and methods, this part, as compared to introductions, right, I would say it's a lot easier than writing introductions, right? The reasons being is that when it comes to data, we ourselves involved in collecting data, right? So what it means from this case, we should know on how to write on data, right? Because we ourselves go to step by step, collecting data from the sources, put the data in our Excel file, and then transfer our data in whatever software that we would like to use, econometric or statistical software. So we ourselves are doing it. So it's easy for us to describe the data themselves. Right? Unlike introductions, we have to read a lot and try to put some thought on how to organize them, and to state the contribution is not something easy, right? But data are quite straightforward. And when it comes to methods, the methods also would be quite easy, right, in terms of writing. The reason being, right, if you look at, right, just to be frank here, if you look at all of the articles that we have written before, including my articles, for example, we use the empirical methods, or we use econometric methods, or other statistical methods that are available there, right? Where many other people have used them. Like, for example, there's thousands of articles that have used panel data modeling, thousands of articles that have used time series, right? And there are many thousand articles also that have used survey data. And on top of that, for example, they use structural equations modeling. So there are a lot of work that have used the same framework. So to describe them, right, will not be something difficult. The only thing would be we need to understand those methods ourselves, right? And understand, not just knowing, right, but being able to describe, being able to know the weaknesses of the methods, being able to know the strengths of the methods. So that's what we have to know regarding the methods themselves, right? Now, the only part of the methods which I'm going to touch on today would be on the choice of methods. And that one will be something that we have to basically put some thought at what methods that we need to use in order to address our objective, right? And always remember, the center of the article that we are writing is our research objective, right? Our research objective is the center. So the method that we choose must be able to address the research objective, whatever it is, right? Now we are going to look at the methods and data, and at the same time, right, please pay attention in terms of the differences, right, in terms of data and in terms of methods. Because once we know the differences of various methods and data, I will tell you, inform you later on what I mean by differences in data, especially in the context of measurements, so that we can put a strategy right away when we write our paper, right? When we describe our data and when we choose our method, we can strategize in the context of the next step, which means the results. Right? We can strategize on basically the most important element that many examiners or assessors or reviewers would look at, whether you have robustness checks or not, right? Because mostly when you write the articles, we lack robustness, right? We do not subject our conclusions to basically thorough scrutiny, whether that conclusions will remain the same or not under different settings, under different assumptions, under different modeling. So those are type of things that we have to put some thought right now, because later on when we go to the results and presentation of results, we become clear on how to organize our results. So I will hint a little bit here, because more details would be in the series number 6, when I look at when I will discuss on how to present the result and how to discuss the results, right? So what I'm going to go through for this one, I'll provide you introduction first, right? And then I will discuss data, variables, and sources, right? And then I will go to data preliminaries, right? And up until this point, we should be able to break for 15 minutes. And then when I come back, I will discuss in details the empirical methods. Right? Now, the focus here, please understand, is not to learn about the methods, but on writing the section that say empirical methods or methodology of the research. Right? How to write the empirical methods. Right? And in terms of what methods and the skills, of course, is beyond the scope of this workshop, because this workshop focuses on writing. But then in the Q&A, we can discuss in the context of various types of methods without going into details, because each method requires, let's say, 4 hours. Right? For me to describe, for example, the traditional panel, very simple panel, it needs 3 or 4 hours to describe the whole theories behind the traditional panels. But then at least if you have anything to ask regarding methods that you are thinking of using, or you have used, for example, but you have some doubt and you have many alternative methods and you're not sure which one to use, then we can discuss in terms when it comes to Q&A. Okay? So these are the plan that I have for today's sessions regarding writing. Right? Remember, we are looking at how to write the data sections and how to write the method sections. Right? And as I mentioned to you at the end, I would like you to feel that writing data as well as writing on the method sections are a lot easier as compared to writing literature review or writing introductions. Right? And sometimes because this part is a lot easier, once you become basically or you write many articles, you become experienced in terms of writing, you will see that this section can be postponed the last one, which means you go directly to the results. Why? Because in terms of method, in terms of data, you already have those in mind. That you just put some notes there without having to write the whole thing yet. You can go and try to explore your data, try to analyze your data first, try to come up with the result first before you can put everything together. Right? But as part of our training, because these are the first one that we have, so let's go through step by steps, right? In terms of how to write the data sections and how to write the methods sections, right? Now, we look at, right, in terms of data and methods within sections, right? Now, from now on, when you read articles, right, do not read articles just to extract information, right? The extract information means that we just go to the article, look at objective, write down the objective, look at the sample that they use, and take this and write down what type of sample that they use, estimation method that they use, right? And then what are the results that they obtained. So those what I mean by extracting information. But from now on, when you read the articles, try to read the way they write, right? How they communicate for each sections, right? If you like the phrase that they use, write down the phrase, right? Because you may want to use that phrase in the context of your own works, right? Of course, you do not copy the phrase word by words, but then you can use the same phrase, put in different context, adapt it a little bit, modify a little bit to meet your needs, right? To meet to convey the information that you would like to convey, right? Now, when it comes to data and methods written in articles, right? If you notice in the way that the whole article is structured, right? For example, I put in here basically structure number 1, structure number 2, and structure number 3. Of course, there may be more, right? But this is what I see to be the dominant structure, the main one that people use in writing the articles, right? And you look at structure number 1, section 3, we have done introductions, right? We have done literature review. Now we have section 3. They put together data and methods, and sometimes they call methodology, right? Sometimes they call empirical models, right? So they put together data and methods in one sections, right? And they divide this, then they have subsections. One, they discuss the data and variables. And the 3.2, they discuss basically 3.2, they discuss empirical methods here. Right? You look at empirical methods. Now they have two subsections. Right? That one structure that you may see in many articles, right? And sometimes under 3, they switch, which means they discuss the method first and second the data, right? So which way is acceptable, right? Whether you discuss data first and you go to empirical methods, or you discuss the method first and you go to data set. And sometimes they do not have subsections, but then they put together these two in one big sections of 3, data and methods, which means they do not divide into 3.1 and 3.2. So that one structure in the context of data and methods, right? Now, you look here, data have its own separate sections and method have its own separate subsections, right? And the structure number 2, you look at, right? They put in introductions, literature, and they have 2 big sections, one for data, right, and one for methods, right? One for data and one for methods. And we look at sometimes the method first and the data seconds. It doesn't matter, not so much make big difference in the context of what you want to discuss first, method or data first. But these are the structure number 2 that you may see in the articles. Now, structure number 3, right, which are basically also in the articles, they have only sections on methods, but data they put together with the results, right? With the results, right? And normally in this method, the description of data will be brief, right? Will be brief, right? Now, what I'm going to discuss today is on the structure number 1 and 2, where we have data as separate sections, okay? And I will talk a little bit in the context of number 3, why some articles put data together with the results, right? So these are 3 different structures that you may have, or you may realize you take a look at the articles that you read, right? And I think I have 8 articles that have been requested by you, right? And you look at all those 8 articles. For those who have those articles, just take a look at what structure that they have, right? Do they have data separately from the discussions on empirical methods, or they put together, or they put data together with the results, right? These are something that basically you need to look at the article. And that's why when I mentioned, when we start learning on how to write, not just to extract information, just look at the structure of the articles that you are reading, right? As well as the way that they write, both of them, right? The structure, how they organize points and so on, how they structure the article from introductions to the end. So that's what we have to look at, right? Because now we have to be able to not only take informations, but then to learn the writing from what we have read. So that's really important part, right? So these are 3 different structure of the article. Now, when you have these 3 different structures, the next thing that we have to ask, obviously, which one should I use for my articles, right? Which one should I use for my article? That would be the obvious. Which structure, right? So I give you a very simple guide here in terms of which structure that need to be used. Right? You have to ask yourself how much you have to explain, right? You ask yourself how much you have to explain, right? Because when you discuss regarding the data itself, for example, right, your discussions must be clear enough so any readers, right, who are in the same area as yours, who are researchers, should be able to reconstruct back the samples, right? So for example, let's say that you mentioned I use competitive measures competition measures based on the cost function. You just explain in that way. No one will be able to reconstruct because it's not clear enough, it's not detailed enough. So you have to ask yourself very important key thing in order to choose which structure of writing data and methods, how much you have to explain. Right? Now, how much you have to explain will be related to the way you construct the samples, right? The way you gather the data, the way you construct the samples, right? And that's why mostly studies that use survey data, for example, they have one separate sections on sample and data. Why? Because they have to explain a lot of things, right? They have to explain their instruments, which means what they put in the survey. They have to explain the respondent profile, right? They have to explain the sampling methods, right? They have to explain the populations. And from the data they have collected, they have to explain how they construct the measures that they want to use in the article. So they have to explain a lot. So in that context, normally we have data one sections, right? So variable measurements, how you measure the variables, right? Some of us may use the variables that are basically well understood within the academic circles or within the policy circles. Right? For example, I'm looking at the impact of, let's say, oil price on inflation, right? And everyone knows what oil price means. When I said everyone knows, it means those who are in the area, right? Those in the area, the average persons that do the research in the area. They know about GDP, they know about oil price, they know about inflation, right? The meaning of inflation. In that way, you don't have to describe a lot in terms of the way that you measure the variables, right? You just can mention, for example, CPI is based on the consumer price index, right? And oil price, you use, let's say, either the West Texas Intermediate or Brent crude oil price, for example. So you just need to explain very brief. You don't have to go into details in terms of constructing, right? Constructing the measurements for the variable. In that context, you don't need separate sections to describe regarding your variables, okay? But if, for example, your variable measurements, okay, require explanations, right? The way that you have constructed, right? For example, let's say a good example, some of you writing on financial inclusions, and you want to explain your measures of financial inclusions, right? You take a look at what people have done in the past in terms of financial inclusion, starting from very crude measure of financial inclusions based on ATMs, based on branches, based on the number of accounts, based on the number of deposits and so on. Now you want to put them together in one index, and you suggest certain index, for example, and you apply certain approach in order to construct your measurements. Let's say you use SERMA method, which based on the reverse Euclidean distance, for example, normalized Euclidean distance, right? If you say in your article, for example, I apply the SERMA methods based on the reverse normalized Euclidean distance, right? And the method is still new, not many people know them. Right? In that way, maybe the readers may not be able to reconstruct, but you have to give more details in terms of the measurements. So at the end, whether you should have the data separately from the methods depends on this one. How much you have to explain, right? How much you have to explain. Normally, if you have to explain substantially, then you use structure number 2, because you have to explain a lot. Right? Because normally one section in the article should not take more than 3 pages, for example, right? It should not take 3 pages. Now, when they say 3 pages, 3 pages of journal articles, so in your in our write-up, it can be up to 5 or 6 pages, right? Double space and so on, but then it should not be longer than that, right? So if you have to explain a lot, for example, then you should separate data from the methods. But if you have to explain to a certain extent, but not as too brief, then you can have both in the same sections, but you create a subsection for data and empirical methods. Okay? So you take a look in the context of this. You have data, variables, and you have to describe everything regarding data and variables. Right? So whether you want to have this and this depends on how long. Right? Once you write, you know how long, and you know whether to use format number 1 or format number 2. But then if, as I mentioned, right, your sample construction is easy. I take data from, let's say, the Central Bank of Indonesia, and this data is non-performing financing, for example. And then the other variable, you want to look at whether the non-performing financings affect by business cycle or not. And both data is basically standard data. In that context, you may revert to structure number 3 because you do not have to explain much. The source is reputable, well-known. The data measurements are standard. You don't need to explain a lot. Right? In that context, you can use structure number 3. Right? So these are basically some of the guidelines that I give you in terms of whether to have data as separate sections or data different from the methods. Right? So look at the way that you construct the samples. Now, when it comes to this, right, the most important part here, right, when it comes to this, you have to pay attention to details, right? Which means that as researchers, when you collect data, you have to write down, right, everything related to the data itself, right? You have to write down everything related to data. Very important part in terms of when you want to write, you are not going to forget, right, where those data come from, for example. So those are really important part. Pay attention to details, right? Pay attention to the way that the variables are measured. Pay attention to the sources of the data. So these are many things that I will try to explain to you in more details when we go through the writing the data sections. So let's presume that we would like to construct, right, data from, so we will try to describe the data points or the data that we have used. And let's say we plan to write in such a way that we have data as separate sections from the methods or separate subsection from the methods, which means I refer to structure number 1 and structure number 2. Okay? Now, when it's said from data, okay, very important parts. The first one that you have to mention, you have to write down what are the sources of the data. Okay? Very important. If there are online sources, for example, right, copy the address that you get that sources, because there are many online sources, right, of the data point. Right? For example, you may get stock price data from Yahoo Finance, for example. Okay? So just jot down that you get from here, your stock price data. So there are many different sources that you use, and you have to provide that sources of your data set. Right? Now, when you look at the sources, right, and when you extract the data, pay attention, right, to the definitions of the variables, right, that you get the data from, right? Because these are type of thing that sometimes, as a young researchers, right, we overlook, right? Because I have encountered many occasions when I ask the writers or researchers regarding their data, what is the definition of that data point, right? In very simple way, I ask, for example, is this GDP per capita or not? Is this GDP nominal value or real value, right? Because data are reported in nominal term and in real term for GDP, for example, right? Right now, right? If GDP, right, in real term in USD or in domestic currency. For example, these are all the details in data that you have to write down, right? And sometimes you have to look at your data. Like for example, if you look at capital ratio, right? Does the data provide capital divided by total assets or capital divided by total asset multiplied by hundreds, right? Of course, in the analysis, they may make no difference, but it makes difference in terms of interpretations, right? Because we have to interpret differently because the scale of measurement is different. So you have to take some note in terms of that data constructions, right? Where those data are from, the source of data, okay? Do you apply certain criteria in putting data together, for example, right? And mostly these are applicable, very applicable to panel data set, but also applicable to basically the time series data set or even cross-sectional data set. What criteria that you use, right? So those are type of things that you have to put in, right? When you put firms together, when you put banks together, when you put the stock markets, right, or stock prices, stock indices, what criteria that you use, right? Some are very direct. For example, you focus on oil and gas sector, right? Some are not so direct. You say you consider all Islamic and conventional banks and you put them together. But what criteria that you apply to choose certain banks to be in your sample and certain bank not in your sample? So this one you have to write down carefully, right? What criteria you apply. And in fact, in terms of criteria, in terms of screening your data sets, of course, you can refer to the practices, what people have done before, right? And the data can be constructed in many alternative ways, right? I give you examples, right? Let's say that you would like to look at the behavior of the stocks during the time of COVID-19, right? I just read one or two articles that have been submitted to the conference on COVID-19, where I reviewed the article, for example, right? And look at the way they measure COVID-19, they measure in terms of dummy variables, right? COVID-19 period, dummy variables starting from January 2020 up until the end of the data points, right? That definitions of COVID-19. But that one way of constructing the sample, right? Some other people construct them based on the intensity or the severity of the cases. How many cases? Some construct in terms of how many deaths, right? So there are many different ways how sample and data are constructed, right? So those are type of things that you have to look at. When you put all banks together, for example, very important. So these are some thought process that you have to put in place because later on, right, you may use them. You may take advantage of the way that you construct the samples, and from that constructions, for example, you can use for robustness checks. Right? Let's say I construct data, I look at financial inclusions, I look at OIC. Right? Some of you look at financial inclusions and growth in OIC. I think I have one proposals, one articles that you are writing, looking at financial inclusions and growth in OIC. I construct my data point. Look at your sample, for example. You may say, okay, I take all OICs. That one my first requirements. Okay? And the second criteria that you may want to apply, I take only OIC countries that have Islamic finance. And that may be a different way of constructing. Why you do those? Because you want to see whether by limiting the sample later on, provide robust results or not, or provide the same result or not. So those are type of things that you have to consider when you construct your samples, right? The criteria that you put in, right? The sources, right? There are many different sources, how you put those sources together, for example, right? Have the article that look at crisis. They have two samples that they construct because there are two different ways of construct sample based on definition of crisis. One, they just took global financial crisis. So they look at the test the hypothesis only using those years of data, 2008, 2009, right? And The other one, they construct the sample based on the crises that are identified, that are unique for each country, right? So they take the countries, they take data point, and they look at the definition of crisis that have been provided, but not global financial crisis, but banking crisis or inflation crisis, government debt crisis, all type of crisis. But then there are database that identify what year this country have this crisis. So that the second way they can construct the data. So you have to look at the way that you construct the data, right? And always know the limitation of your data point, right? All these you have to explain, right? These are things that you have to explain in terms of the way you construct the data, right? For examples, right? You construct the data based on these three countries, right? You have to start to think, why these three countries? Why not 4? Why not 5? Right? A lot of things. These are common things that people will ask. Right? When you put number in your data, right? People will ask, why not before? Why not after? Why 4, not 5? Why 5, not 6? Whatever number you put in. And that's why you have to put some thought in terms of explaining your samples, right? It's always people ask when you said I use time series data starting from 1990 up to 2018. People will ask why you start in 1990. Right? Maybe data available before that, right? So you have to explain, you have to justify your data points. So that's very important, right? When you construct the data, you have the reasons why you construct your data the way that you construct, right? Now, when it comes to variables measurements, now how you measure the variables, right? And in the proposal that you have, there are so many different aspects, different variables that you put in financial inclusions, for example, right? Ethnicity you put in, right? And there are many other variables, right, that you want to use in your work, right? Now, these are type of things that you have to ask. Are you, when you take the data, do you use them directly in your analysis, or you apply standard expressions? What I mean by standard expression, you take GDP and then you take national log of GDP, right? Or you take CPI and you construct inflation based on that CPI. So these are basically data that are used directly, right? And or with standard expressions. You express in national log, you express in growth form, you express in ratio form, for example. So those are standard in the context of data measurements. Or you apply, of certain methods, right? Not, I'm missing the word method there. Or you apply certain methods to arrive at data required to perform the analysis, right? As I mentioned to you before, you are interested in financial inclusions. You collect data that represent various aspects of financial inclusions, and you apply min-max index method, just an example, to construct financial inclusions index, right? Or you get the data for many type of data, for example, right? You get many type of data, let's say financial developments, where you have credit, and you apply principal component method in order to construct the index, right? And many studies in the banking, they look at efficiency, right? Does banking efficiency affect the monetary transmission mechanism? So you have to construct data on efficiency. And let's say you construct data. How you construct? You estimate the cost of the profit function first, so that you can look at the cost efficiency of the bank, right? So you have, these are the applications of certain methods in order to construct, to measure your variables, right? So sometimes you have to go to that extent, which means that you have your data that you have collected, but you do not use them directly into your regressions. You use that data to derive a measure that need to be used in your regressions, right? So those are type of things that you have to look at in terms of variable measurements. And in fact, when you have these, for example, applications of certain methods to arrive at the data that are required for the analysis, normally when you have this, we will write our our data sections separate from the method sections, because you want to explain in details on how you basically derive the measurements of the variables, right? Because some variables, the measurements require more explanations, right? And when it comes to variable measurements, pay attention, right? The choice of data that you have, or the way you measure, or the proxy that you use, right? Because one variable that you are looking at may be measured in different way, right? May be measured in different way. In fact, when you look at your literature review, you will get some idea from your literature review, for examples, right? The measurements of the variables, right? If you look at market structure, there are so many different ways that people measure market structure, right? There are traditional way of measuring market structure, and there are non-traditional way of measuring market structure, what we term as new industrial organizations approach, right? The traditional way they use, for example, the concentration ratio, right? The market share belong to the 3 largest firms, 3 largest banks, or 5 largest firms, or 5 largest banks. So they use concentration ratio. But there are also, right, the measurements that derive from the pricing ability of the banks or of the firm, where they take the price minus with the cost divided by the price. And they call this the ability to price above the cost, which reflect the market power of the firms, right? So there are many different ways, which one that you choose, right? So you have to look at carefully, right? And this is, again, going back to your literature review, because literature review will provide a lot of feedback, a lot of information to you, right? When you want to measure, let's say, financial stability, a big topic right now that people look at, how you measure financial stability. Right? And when you look at, sometimes people use distance to defaults, which means they use the Z score. Sometimes people use non-performing loans. Sometimes people use loan loss provisions, right? So these are various types of measures of stability. And there are more measures. I just give you some examples, which one that you use, right? As your main variable to measure, as a main way of measuring your variables. So you have to give justification jot down, right? So these are a way of basically read back the literature, look at what people have used, look at their justifications, writing down, because later on when you want to write, for example, right, the data sections and describe your variables, you have to provide justifications. You cannot just say that, okay, in order to measure bank stability, I use the Z score, for example, and stop right there. Right? You have to explain how the Z score is measured, because there are many different ways of measuring Z score too. People want to know exactly how you measure them, right? So these are knowledge that you have to know in terms of constructing the variable themselves. And why you use this? Why not others? Right? You use this, why? Because to be consistent with existing studies, many have used them. And what are the benefits of this? So these are type of things that you have to put down to help you to write, right, the data sections. Right? As I mentioned to you, right, data sections is a lot easier. Why? Because you are hands-on. You are collecting data. And as you collect, you jot down. If you transform the data and you derive other measurements based on the data you have collected, you know exactly how you transformed it, right? But very important in terms of choosing the measures that you use to represent the variables, right? You must have justifications. And these justifications here, very important, relate to your key variables only. Right? You don't have to justify all other, right, control variable in terms of the way you measure them. Right? When it comes to other variables that you put into your analysis, not your key variables, those need to be justified why you include them only, not on the measurements. Right? But when it comes to measurements, how you measure them, your dependent variables, right, you must justify why you measure them. Right? In the case that in the literature, there are many measures that has been used. Right? The example I just given, stability, there are many measures. Financial developments, there are many measures. Financial inclusion, there are many measures available out there. Right? So you have to know on how to justify those. So these are kind of note taking and put down, right? So that when you want to write, you know exactly what to put in terms of the writing. Right? So sample constructions and variable measurements. So these are basically the one that you need to put your effort in, right? When you compile your data. Now, a lot of people, right, do not pay attention much about data, right? Why? Because there are many standard official source of data available where you can download and put the Excel file and transfer into the statistical software and perform the analysis, right? And because these are standard coming from reputable institutions, for example, from the World Bank, from the IMF, right? And from many other sources, right? Or subscribed sources like Bloomberg data streams, right? Bloomberg data stream and so on, because they come from all these sources, for example, right? So you do not pay much attention, right? Or we do not pay much attention. But remember, right? The quality of results depends critically on the data that you use, right? If you put garbage in your software, you'll get garbage out of your software, right? That's the key point, because sometimes we do not pay attention, right? When we look at data, we do not look at definitions, thinking that these are from official sources, it must be right, for example, right? So you have to be careful. You have to pay attention into details when it comes to collecting data and put your sample or gather your samples for the purpose of the analysis to address whatever the objective that you have. Okay? You have to be careful. And I stress a lot in terms of data because we do not want to have giggle or garbage in, garbage out at the end. And we do not want to waste our time either. What I mean by waste our time in terms of this case, we put a lot of time of gathering data, but then we do not pay attention in terms of measurements and so on. When we use and estimate the models, and later on we realize, or people basically mention to you that the data that you have used are wrong way of measuring the variable, for example. Now what you have to do, you have to go back and recollect the data, putting back your samples, redo back your estimations. And that's a waste of time, right? We don't have much time. Right? You just take a look at, right? Despite the task that has been given, right? We still not being able, not because you are not trying to do it, but then because we have a lot of things to do, right? We have other obligations and so on. And that's why we have to basically be efficient in the context of collecting data, efficient in such a way that pay attention into details, right? Hopefully we do not need to come back and try to collect data and redo the whole process again. And that one very important part in terms of data measurements, right? Now, when it comes to data, we look at in terms of variable and sources, right? Now, just pay attention to this also, right? Data represents measurements of variables, right? Measurements of variable. When it comes to measurements of variables, right, it means they measure certain characteristics, right? Right? And measurements of the variables means that that characteristics, that measures vary over times, right? Vary over times. I have some raised hands. I'm not sure. Nadia, should I take the questions or should I complete first?
Please complete first.
Complete first, okay, thank you. Okay, you look at data measurements, right? It represents the characteristics that you try to measure. And that when you said variables, that values, right, is vary over times or over individuals, or both, right? So that the meaning of variables. Now, when you put data together, the other thing that you have to look at the structure of your data, right? And this is quite, I think, something straightforward. I think all of you understand. When it comes to structure of a data set, we can classify the structure of data into 3 parts. We have cross-sectionals, right? Meaning that we put data together across different units, right? Most of survey data is cross-sectionals. Most survey that you use. Why? Because at a point in time, you send out a survey through online to the samples that you randomly selected, right? And they give you the feedback and you compile them. So this is basically cross-sectional data set because it's across individuals, okay? Or you look at firms at a given point in time, right? Let's say that you compile data on firm during the time of COVID-19, right? So your data point is only 2020, right? You take financial statement on 2020, for example, of all firms, and you put them together. So these are cross-sectional data sets, right? And we have time series data sets, okay, over time for given units. Right? I think some of you will use time series data set where you compile data on stock prices. Some of you compile data on the certain measures on the banking sector, and some you compile sometimes is data on basically the macro variables. For the case of Indonesia, and you try to write an article on those. So these are time series data over time, right? And you have panel data sets, which means you put data together where they have both the individual units, cross-sectional unit, and time series. You have banks, right? 50 banks, each bank have 5 years, for example, right? So these are different types of structure your data points, right? Now, why is this important? Because when it comes to different structure of data point, right, the way you write might be different because the method you use would be different, right? Because when it comes to time series data set, right, for example, you have to look at what method you have adopted. And sometimes you have to describe step by step how you proceed from one step to the next step, right, in making the analysis, right? When you have panel data sets, for example, maybe you describe a little bit differently, right? Because diagnostic is different, right? So those are different. And that's why you have to know your data sets, right? Cross-sectional, time series, and panel data sets, right? And there are really more important that I try to mention later on. The mistake, not the mistake, but basically not the right thing to do in terms of describing your methods, right? So I will mention later on the difference between specifications and estimations. Very important, and people mix up between these two, right? People do not understand what we mean by specifications and estimations. Right? Even many I have seen, even many established writers, for example, sometimes they are not clear. Why? Because they just take this directly from econometrics, from statistics, without understanding in details the meaning of econometrics and statistics, right? Because most of us use software. We just click the software, we get the result and so on without understanding in details, right? So, but that's important when it comes to writing, right? Now, this, as I mentioned, what you have to note down when you look at your data point. The sources. How are variables defined and measured? At the sources. If I take GDP per capita from the World Bank, WDI, World Development Indicators, I take up, of course, when you download, they will provide the definitions, but then you have to be aware of that definitions. GDP per capita, and they will write there in constant USD dollar. What that means? That means I'm taking real GDP per capita, where that real GDP is measured in terms of USD, right? Not local currency. So you have to know that details in terms of the way you measure the variable when you take from the secondary sources. Okay? Of course, when you take primary sources, you are the one that define the data. Okay? But when you take from secondary sources, know the way the data are defined. Okay? Some of you may use World Governance Indicators Index, World Governance Indicators database. And you go in, you take the data out, and one of data, political stability. Political stability. So you take the data out, political stability, you have to know how that political stability are constructed, right? You cannot just take out, because it's very important, right? Why important? Because at this point, right, if you know exactly on how they measure, when you go to interpretations, it would be a lot easy. And I will go into details next week, or not next week. In phase number 6, how should we interpret the results, right? Where you may not see in many articles, because many articles, they just interpret the result, but they do not give the full interpretations, right? But I will try to give you the full interpretation of results when the series comes, right? You have to look at how political stability is constructed, right? You may refer to existing articles that have used political stability, or you go to the definitions, right? And if you look at political stability, for example, from World Governance Indicators, they say this variable is constructed based on a survey, or based on this and that, and it's normalized with the value ranging from -2.5 to 2.5, with the mean value equal to 0, right? So that's the way they construct the variables, right? Because this is very important, right? The other part that I'm not putting here, when it comes to the variables, for example, measurement, there are many different scales. There are ordinal scales, right? And ratio scales, right? And there are nominals, right? So those are various types of scales of measurements, right? But I will not pay attention that I'm not going to pay attention there, because mostly we are going to use quantitative variable or qualitative variable. I will describe the next thing, right? But pay attention to that measurements, how the variables are defined and the variables are measured. Because when you look at the way variable measured and defined, it will give you it will make it easy for you when you write on the data sections, right? Because you know the way that you define the variables, right? Exactly on how the source defined it, right? And these are very important parts, right? When you take ATM, for example, branch ATMs for constructing financial inclusions, right? So they use the number of ATM per 100,000 adult populations. And that's the detail that you need, right? Write down the definitions, the measurements of the variable that you get, right? Very important, right? As mentioned, I stress a lot, because this will make your data collection efficient and will make it easy for others to reconstruct your samples. Very important. When you write both data and method sections, always putting in mind, it have to be clear so that people can replicate what you have done. And that the objective of data and methods. People can replicate. Of course, the method have to address your objective, but the aim of this method, people can replicate what you have done. Okay? So that's why you have to put attention into details. Note down the sources. Okay? And then how variables are measured based on the data compiled. Do you transform them? That I mentioned before. Do you take national logs? Why you take national log? All those things need to be put in place, right? And then look your variable quantitative or qualitative, right? And most of us look Islamic Bank, for example, that qualitative aspect, because it's quite attribute of the bank, whether Islamic or non-Islamic, or what we term as conventionals, right? Sometimes we look at a crisis, right? Global financial crisis, that qualitative, COVID-19, qualitative, but it can be made quantitative, of course, in terms of COVID-19, if you look at deaths or you look at the number of cases. So those are type of things that you have to look at, right, in the context of the variable measurements. So these are data, variables, and sources that you have to put in. Right? I will give you examples, very simple examples later on, based on the articles that has been requested by some of you. I will go to that articles. I will try to show in that articles how they put the data sections later on. Right? As I mentioned before, we write the data sections, and we write data sections separately if we have a lot to explain. Right? But if we do not have a lot to explain, we do not need to have data sections separate from method sections. And when I say separate, can be under one section, but you have two different subsections, as in structure number 1 that I have noted down before, or in structure number 2, where data stand on its own from the methods, right? So you have a lot to explain. And a lot or not a lot to explain, right, is basically depend on these things, right? And for your case, I would like to you to train yourself to write using structure number 1 or structure number 2, which means try to explain your data point. Right? Get use of explaining your data. Right? So I will look at how we structure and we explain our data point. Right? So these are the things that you have to look at in the context of your data sets. Right? So more or less, what I try to mention here when it comes to data, variables, and sources, right? For example, data and variable and sources, right? It is someone who work, these are basically relate to us, right? Who do research, who do hands-on, and we have to know exactly what we have done, right? See, and all of us should be able to explain what we have done. In fact, in terms of this case, unlike in terms of introductions, we read and we are not doing introductions, right? Because we just read and we try to put all things together, try to justify things. But when it comes to data and methods and estimating the result, we put our hand dirty. We are the one that doing it, so we must be able to explain. How to explain them is the writing parts that I will try to touch upon a little bit later on. Right? So these are basically data and variable. And normally when we present the data, right, these are mostly required. Mostly, I said, not totally required, because in some article they may not have this, right? And depending on the type of data that you have, for example, right, type of data that you have, right? You must explain your data point, that your data, what I term it as data preliminaries, before you perform the analysis, right? And descriptive statistics, right? Descriptive statistics is very important. And correlation tables, right? It's very important, especially when you have cross-sectional data sets or panel data sets. Very important. Now, why I say this one very important? Right? I would like you to look at the articles. Right? You just take 2 or 3 articles that have been published that use secondary data set, not survey data. Right? And try to look at the first and second tables. Right? I think if you pick up 10, I would say 9 articles will have descriptive statistics and correlation tables, right? But then pay attention also on the discussions on this. You will be surprising that in data sections, even if they put in descriptive statistics and correlations, the discussions is short. It's not long, right? Mostly 1 paragraph, right? When they discuss descriptive statistics and correlations, right? So this you have to wait first, right? Shorts. But then what needs to be discussed when we provide descriptive statistics, right? But normally in data preliminaries, when you get all your data points set, you measure all your variables, normally we provide descriptive statistics and correlations, right? Now, I will discuss a little bit, because normally here we put descriptive statistics okay, together with the discussions on the data sections, okay, on the data sections. So when we put descriptive statistic on data sections, then we have to know on how to write on the descriptive statistic or what not to write on descriptive statistics. Okay? And then I will try to mention in terms of correlations, okay? What need to be written related to the correlation between the variables. And in certain contexts, okay, time series framework, for example, okay, in data sections, or maybe normally in time series, they put this together in result sections. You perform certain tests first, not the main regression that you have done, but you have to verify certain things first before you proceed and estimate your models, right? And in time series, maybe some of you are aware, you have to conduct what we term as unit root tests and co-integration tests first. So these are what we term as data preliminaries that you have to do first. And normally people do this together with data sections, right? And if you use survey data, right, you have to describe your survey, especially profile your respondents. Right? Who are your respondents that you get? Right? When you say profile, would be the age, the male, the incomes, and many others that people should know in the context of profile your respondents, right? That you have to put in first. And normally in empirical papers, you will see this, right? And they are required, right? And I put here mostly required because I see few articles, they do not put descriptive statistic or correlations or any other information regarding the data, right? But more than 90% of the articles, they have both descriptive statistic and correlations. Let me discuss a little bit in terms of descriptive statistics. What need to be put in the context of descriptive statistics, right? And normally in descriptive statistics, you put in the mean, the standard deviations, right? Or I have the table here. Let me put the tables in terms of descriptive statistics. Right? These are normally some table that you use. I just give typical data tables, right? You look at, you have variables, you have definitions. These are the dependent variables and where the source comes from, WDI, and then based on author's calculation, because you use definition of 3-year rolling standard deviations of GDP per capita growth. Financial inclusion definition a little bit, expected relations without volatility is negative, means that the more in countries that are more financially included, right, volatility will be less. Where you get data from, Financial Development Index. So these are typical tables. Now, when it comes to descriptive statistic and correlation, I do not put correlations here. Normally in descriptive statistic, we look at the means, we look at standard deviations, we look at we look at minimum, and we put maximum, and some median, for example. Right? So these are basic descriptive statistics that we put. Now, very important part that I have to mention here before I put everything in the context of data sections. Okay? When we want to discuss descriptive statistic tables, right? Descriptive statistic table, we should not discuss the obvious. What I mean by the obvious, restating. We just restate, right? We just restate what is in the table and write on the text. Right? So I've seen articles, right? They put descriptive statistics. When it comes to writing, they write, for example, the mean of financial inclusion is, and its standard deviation is, it have the minimum value of and the maximum value of. And that in the paragraph. But if you write in that way, it doesn't add anything. Right? It doesn't add anything. Why I say it doesn't add anything? Because it just restate what from the tables. Right? So if you would like, for examples, right, to discuss descriptive statistics, you have to look at all descriptive statistics and you have to think of what needs to be highlighted, what you want to bring out other than the mean, the standard deviation, the minimum, maximum, because those values has been given. But what those values say, right? Or what I try to say in terms of this case is that how to inform readers based on those values, right? What information that you want to provide. Right? For example, you can say, right? From descriptive statistics, we may have seen big variations in the financial inclusions across countries. Right? See, big variation, why? The minimums, then you can put in the minimums, which refer to, let's say, what country have minimum financial inclusion, let's say Zimbabwe. In the sample, the Zimbabwe have the lowest. Now you bring in a little bit so that people can appreciate your descriptive statistics. Right? So this is what I mean in terms of bringing up the information from descriptive statistics, but not just repeating what in descriptive statistics. And what you bring up must be key to your research objective, must be related directly to your research objective. You do not want to highlight something that are not relevant to your research hypothesis, right? You have to bring up those parts. Then just think of 2 or 3 points that you can bring up from descriptive statistics, right? And as I mentioned, something that you should not do when you describe descriptive statistics is basically just repeat the value in the table and writing in the sentence, writing in the paragraph. That's something that you should not do, right? Because you just state the obvious. Right? You just state the obvious. Now, and correlation tables. Why we put correlation table before I come back to descriptive statistics, right? Later on, why so important here in terms of descriptive statistics? When it comes to correlation table, you look at pairwise correlation, there are 2 things, right? That you have to bring up from correlation tables. The first one, when you look at correlation table, let me put some text so that some of you can take notes here. The first one, right? You want to get preliminary indications, right? Preliminary indications, right? On the relations between your dependent variables. How do your dependent variables related to explanatory variable or independent variable, especially your key variables, right? These are preliminary indications. How are they related? That's the first thing that you would like to highlight, right? Of course, it's not definitive. Right? The result might be different, but at least you can get a first look on how your dependent variable related to your independent variables, right? Of course, you can see this just indicative. It's not definitive yet. You have to analyze further detail using the regressions or using whatever method you want to use. But they did provide some early indications on how they are related. Very important. And the second one, you want to ensure that your independent variables is not highly correlated. Independent variables, not highly correlated. You want to mention this. If they are highly correlated, you want to inform the readers how you want to address that in terms when you implement your estimations. When you conduct your estimation, for example, right? You have pairs of the independent variables that are highly correlated, how you would address that problem. So these are 2 reasons why you put in correlations tables, and that you have to highlight. And if you look at, by stating this, you don't have to say a lot, you don't have to say much, right? Regarding basically, regarding the tables that you need. So these are the first 2 tables in your models, right? And as I mentioned, the table regarding definitions, right? Some articles put in, some articles do not put in. But if you have many, for example, to make it easy for people to refer to, you have many variables that are involved, not just 3 or 4 variables. Right? You should have tables to explain, because people can refer to, doesn't have to go back to the text and try to search. You can go directly to table number 1. They can see, for example, these are definitions of variables. But if you have only 4 or 5 variables or less, for example, you don't need to put in table form. Right? You don't need in table form. You just explain in the text. Right? Now, I mentioned to you that I would like to discuss a little bit in terms of descriptive statistics. Why so important for descriptive statistics, even if we do not want to discuss much regarding descriptive statistics. And in fact, right, if you notice some articles, they put descriptive statistics, but they never discuss about descriptive statistics in the text. They just mentions table 1 presents descriptive statistic and table 2 present correlation table. As may be noted from table 2, right, pairwise correlation between independent variable are low and less than in all cases, in less than 0.4. Thus multicollinearity, so it's not a concern. You will see in certain articles, they do not touch at all regarding descriptive statistics, but they present descriptive statistics without discussing. Right? Sometimes we may wonder, why is that the case? And in fact, I myself, when I look at those and pay attention, I wonder why people put descriptive statistics but do not discuss them. Right? The reasons, it would be very important when it comes to interpretation of results. Right? Because you know the mean value of the variables, you know the standard deviations of the variables. Okay? So when we discuss the result, we may want to refer back to the mean, to the standard deviations of the variables. Okay? So that's very important in the context of descriptive statistics. Right? So these are basically, I would encourage you to put in these tables. Okay? If you decide to have a separate sections, right, on data point, right? You put in these variables because this variable very important, right? Or this table very important. Preliminary table that you put in, provide definition, provide data sources, right? And provide basically the descriptive statistic and correlation tables, right? So these are in very good articles, for example, Get the Good Journal, good articles, and so on. You will see these tables are there, right? These tables are there, right? So let me go on to the next one, right? And then I will give you examples, and then we can have Q&A for the first parts, right? And then some later on we can come back for the empirical methods, right? Now, in terms of this one, right? In terms of this, right? Now, typical data write-ups, right? I did not put in, right? I just put here some of the words, some of the phrase that you may encounter, right? That may encounter in terms of data write-ups, right? The first one, the first paragraph, for example, we compile data, right? Or we gather data, right? Or just our samples, right? Our data are from where, right? So which means they provide the sources, right? And they provide the sources, the period that they use, the countries, the firms, whatever structured database, right? For example, we built panel data sets, right? That's comprised, right? 300 banks from 13 countries from here to here. The main source of data is, and that normally in there, right? So the first thing, basically, maybe when you write on data point, you tell first, right, how you gather the data, right? What period it covers, how many countries, how many firms, right? Depending on the characteristic of your samples, right? How many countries, how many samples, and so on, and what are the sources, right? Where the sources are from, right? You didn't have to match. I take X, right? from this source, I take Y from this source, I take Z from this source, right? You don't have to write repeatedly. You can put together. Why? Because you already have tables that you can refer to, right? Which variable from which source in there, right? So it's basically, for example, I used to write, right? I gather data on the variable used in the present study from 3 different sources, right? One, let's say data stream. Second, World Development Indicators. And third, basically Freedom House, right, for institutional index, right? So I don't have to mention which variable from that sources. Why? Because I will refer them back to the table, right? And then I have to mention the data cover what countries, right? Now, when it comes to period, sometimes we have to justify why we start the data in this year, why we end the data in this year. If you have the reasons, right? And most of the reason that people put in, people try to put as many data as possible, but then they are constrained by data availability, whether data available or not. Some people justify in the sense that because they want to focus on the post-crisis, the analysis in post-crisis, and that's why data start in 2010, for example, because they do not want the result to be affected by the crisis episode. They want to look in different way, post-crisis. And I think more and more articles coming up use data post-crisis, right? One article that look at lending financing behavior of Islamic bank coming up in Finance Research Letters, for example, quite good article. They try to look at and compare the Islamic financing with conventional loans, right? Whether they are affected differently by the uncertainty that happens after the crisis, right? So they start the data in 2010, right? Why? Because they're focused in more recent years, right? As time proceeds, people will use more and more recent years, but then you have to justify why you start your data point from this period and you end data point this period, this year, for example. When you put firm countries, why you choose these countries? And that need to be justified, for example. And in order to justify in terms of countries and firm, for example, when you do a panel data sets, right? As I mentioned, you apply the criteria, you may apply the criteria, right? So you can say that the following criteria are applied in including banks in our samples, right? You have to explain what criteria that you apply, right? And based on criteria, what is your final sample look like, right? And one example that I can give you here, the one I just basically, I just completed my writing, right? We first gather data from all banks, right? All banks in the bank scopes from the GCC countries. Then we apply the following criteria. First, right, the bank must have data on financings as well as deposits. Right? Second, the bank must have at least 3 consecutive years of data. Third, the bank must have positive equity. Fourth, the bank's lending to total asset must be more than 10%. So these are all criteria. Right? Now, what criteria to use? Of course, you have to look at the practices. In your area, for example, you may know more than me in terms of what are the basic criteria that people use. That. And based on this criteria, what are the final sample that you get? Okay? The same thing when you compile data, for example, from the survey. Right? You said you mentioned we gather data based on the survey, right, which has been sent to, let's say, 1,000. And from those 1,000 individuals, you receive backs, right? Let's say 250. Right? And you think that 25% of responding rates, that response rate is very good, right? And based on that 250, you further filter, right? The questionnaire that has been sent back to you based on the following, right? The one that I have missing responses on the key variable, you exclude them. So you have to mention all these things and so on. And finally, based on those screening and so on, you arrive at the final sample of, let's say, 187 respondents, and that 187 that you use. So these are normal words that we use in terms of describing the data sets, right? And then when you describe all those things, you don't go to the definition yet, right? There are many different formats, of course. I just try to guide you to one specific format. And then you can present, for example, that the brief definitions of the variable is given in table 1, and then table 2 and table 3, for example, or put together table 2, present descriptive statistics, right? So you can put in that way when you have a separate section on data. Now, remember that this is not only way to write the data section, but I try to give you that and try to train you and try to encourage you to write in this way, because these are more standard way of writing. Right? When you have data separate from the methods, right? Which means that you tell them first where the data come from and what criteria that you use and what are your final sample, and you mentioned about definition of variable and descriptive statistic as well as correlations. Of course, you can describe a little bit in terms of correlations there. And then, right? And then after that, you begin explaining your variables. Right? You have all data points. Now you explain your variables, the one that we have just discussed. That's why you have to take note on how your variables are measured. So you have to explain your variable, your dependent variables, for example, right? And then your independent variable, the key one first, explain in details. And then your control variables, put them together, right? And then justify on the choice of this control variable that you use, right? Based on past studies, right? Now, if you look at into this case, we are moving closer to empirical work, because I have mentioned from the beginning, I will guide you on how to write the empirical papers where you have data, where you have models to perform the analysis and so on, right? And other variations we can discuss in terms of Q&A. For example, if you do not have, if your work is not empirical to start with, for example, and that's this section may not apply to your work, right? May not be applicable to your work. So these are basically the structure of the data, right? Which, as I mentioned, right, we write separately from the methods, right? Now, allow me to give you basically give you allow me to give you an example, right? An example from the write-up, right? Let me see a good examples that has been written. One of the articles that I have sent to one of you that request this article, but when I look at this article, it's quite good article in terms of the writing up of the data sections, where in this article, data section is separate from the method sections, right? Structure number 2, right? So let me share with you these articles that are just coming up in 2020. They look at the impact of bank competitions and concentrations on bank risk-taking behavior and stability. They look at GCC countries, right? And coming up in North American Journal of Economic and Finance. Right? They have exactly the same section as what we have gone through, introductions, right? And then related literature, they perform literature review, and you look at data sections, for example, right? So you look at, they provide you the sources first. How do all kind of construct data here, right? Where they are from, right? We collect data of listed commercial bank in GCC for the period, right, which cover of global financial crisis, and from Bank Scope, Fitch, IBCA database. Right? These are standard database, right? And they mentions why they focus on listed commercial banks. right? You have to justify your work, right? Why listed commercial bank? And the distribution of the sample across countries and so on, right? And then macro data from WDI, exactly the one that I just described to you, where the source of data that they get from. And then they go to the measurements, right? The variable measurements, where this data come from. They don't provide descriptive statistic here. They provide somewhere else descriptive statistics, but they provide the measurements, right? How they measure concentration competitions, they provide the measurements here, right? Bank competition measures, for example, 3.3. They go one by one. This is what I mean by you want to describe your measurements in details. And that's why you need separate sections. You cannot put together with results, or you cannot just put and lump together with methods, right? They want to create separate sections here because they have to go into details in explaining all these things. So risk measures, then control variable putting together and justify them. And at the end, they provide descriptive statistics, right? So you look at more or less in the same way, you look at here, they have tables and so on, the one that I just described. So these are a standard way of describing the data, right? One of the articles there. And in fact, when you look at many other articles, for example, you see more or less the same thing in terms of the way people structure the write-ups, right? People structure the writings. So these are the data section that I would like to share with you, right? Hopefully you take some notes in terms of what needs to be done, right? And very important part, the takeaway here, when you construct your data, write down exactly what you have done and write down exactly how the variables are measured, how the variables are defined, and these are the structure of the write-up of our data sections. And we tell them where the source are from, over which periods, what countries. If we have to give justifications, why we use this data point, why the data in here, why the years here, and so on, right? And what criteria that you use, if you have, right, in terms of those criteria, and what are your final samples. And then explain your variable one by one. So this data sections, right? So I will stop here. We have roughly 15 minutes if anyone have Q&A here on data sections, right? And then we, I think at here, 10 there, which is 11 here in Malaysia. We take 15-minute break first, but then before 15 minutes, you have 15 minutes for Q&A, right? So I give to you back, Nadia, for Q&A, and then we basically go to the method in second sections.
Okay, Prof. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any question, you are welcome to ask Prof. Mansur. Prof,
okay, yeah, Tika raise hand.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Actually, I have several questions. The first one, Prof, if we want to form our own data measurement, and after that subsequently form the index, for example, from financial inclusion index, as you mentioned, the approach of Sharma index is a bit a general financial inclusion. And if we want to make the data, the variable is more to proper data rather than the general one. So, and then we want to use that and form an index based on that. How to justify that, Prof? Because this is our own data measurement and not based on previous how to say approach before. That is, are you getting my question, Prof?
Yeah, I got your questions. You have your own measurements, right?
Yes, yes, okay.
Yeah,
That's the first one. The second one, the one that you show us, the descriptive statistic is more towards the secondary data descriptive statistics. How about if it is a survey data? How to present the descriptive statistics for survey data, since they have many, we have many demographic profile. Do we need to present them all, or maybe you have another suggestion? Can I ask another more question, or we give a turn to others first?
Yep, I am compiling. Okay. Yeah, you can ask.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I am
okay.
compiling. Yeah.
All right. Another one is how to handle missing data, Prof. How to handle missing data? Can we just use the variable which has missing data, or we have to drop? And then another one is about dummy variable. If it is a dummy variable, I just want to make sure whether we have to present a correlation matrix on that too, put it a dummy variable, or we can focus more to other variables. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. Okay, any others? I just compile this year.
One question from, from Bu Nur
Hidayah.
Yes, Bu Nur Hidayah.
Okay.
3 questions.
Yeah. 3. Okay.
Inshallah. Where or in which section should we put or write our hypothesis? If we compare Islamic and conventional banks, can we limit the conventional banks only to have the same size with Islamic banks in order to be an apple-to-apple comparison? And the last one is, in case Indonesian Islamic banks, we just have 3 Islamic banks are merged. How do we treat them? Okay, Prof.
Okay. Okay, 3. I think I see someone raise hands. Final one. One person raise hands. You can unmute and you can ask.
Yeah. Please, Mr. Purwanto, you can allow to talk. Yeah.
I saw someone raise hand. I'm not sure. I cannot see.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Ibu Nadia. Yeah. Okay. My voice is good enough?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Good morning, Prof. Mansur. Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam.
Thank you, Prof, for your explanations. My question is, in secondary data, actually, we have the data, panel data. Now, panel data, it means combining series and cross-sectional. Now, one problem if and then once maybe some of companies or maybe some of it the data is extreme data. Extreme data, it means if we check like classical assumption test, normality, and then what autocorrelations, and then what multi is not good, and then how to treat this data, Prof. Because maybe some of data is maybe extreme data, maybe the highest negative or the highest positive. Yeah, this is how to treat the secondary data. This is my question, Prof. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for all the questions. Sorry. Let me put back. For all the questions that have been asked. All are good, in fact, related to what we have discussed, the data points, right? Related data points. So let me discuss from the last one first, and then we'll go to the first one. I think Purwanto, right? The last one, where you have your data, extreme data. I would say extreme observations, and where these extreme observations sometimes people call as outliers, right? When you construct data. Am I right, Purwanto? You refer to this one, right? So how to treat this, right? Now, this one also go back to your criteria and how you construct the samples. Now, there are, if we look at the literature, for example, in terms of this case, right, there are 2 ways that we do it in terms of addressing extreme observations, or maybe the 3 different ways, right? 3 different ways, I would say, regarding extreme observations, right? And the first way which basically you can afford it, for examples, right? You can drop the firms with extreme observations. Right? You can have some criteria. With a firm with extreme observation, you can drop them, right? On the basis that maybe some sort of recording errors. They have observation to extremes in terms of that, maybe some recording errors, right? Because in the banking, for example, you may see that equity to total assets more than 100s, right? Negative possible, but more than 100s, for example, right? And sometimes people are afraid that this may be recording errors. So they just drop that firms. So that one, right? But then you can do this if you can afford. I mean, afford means that you have big observation, big data, right? You have a lot of data, you have a lot of firms. Dropping one firm will not make any difference, right? The second one, what you can do is when you have extreme observations, right? You can what we do as Winsorize your data. And this is also very standard that people use. What it means by Winsorize means that you replace the top 1% of the values, right, with certain numbers, right? For examples, right, let's say based on 1%, right, the cutoff point of first percentile, for example, 50. And then you have data point above 50. And that above 50 is top 1%. All of those above 50, you replace with 50. Right? That's what we term as Winsorizing. And in certain software like Stata, for example, they have procedure to Winsorize your data set to remove extreme value and reduce the influence of that observations. Right? The third one, right, you just continue, right, to regressions. Right? Continue to regressions with that data point. Right? But later, you perform outlier tests, right? Outlier tests, and remove outliers from your data point. So that one can be done too, right? You perform outlier tests, and then you remove the outliers, right, from your data point. I hope you understand what I'm saying here. These are three different ways that we can basically address extremes observations or outliers in your data point, right? Either you drop, Winsorize it, continue to regressions, but later on you perform robustness check, which means that, okay, I have this data point, but then you check for outliers, you remove that, you rerun them, and you try to see whether the results are the same or not. So those are things that can be done. I have used all these three, depending on the situations, right? On situations, right? So that's three, and that's your choice. Whatever your choice that you make, as I mentioned, you have to explain in your sample constructions, right? Sample constructions, okay? So that first, right? And then coming to Nurul Nadia questions, right? In Indonesia, you have a merger of 3 Islamic banks and becomes one mega Islamic bank, right? And if I'm not mistaken, the merger is only recently, right? Where you don't have enough observation yet post-merger to basically analyze them, right? But mergers basically are something common, right, when you compile data set. Right? For example, in Contact Malaysia, we used to have a lot of domestic conventional banks. After the Asian financial crisis, we end up having only X Bank, where many small banks are merged or are acquired by big banks to create X anchor domestic commercial bank. Right? So mergers are there. So how you treat mergers, how you treat mergers. Now, let's say, I put in this way, right? I put in this way. You have bank A, right? And you have bank B, right? You have bank A. And bank A, you compile data, let's say firm A, firm B. You compile data from 2006, let's say 2006, just put the number here, just for your information, 2019, right? Bank B, you compile data from 2006, right? To, let's say, you have 2012, right? And merger happened between bank A plus bank B in 2013. Let's say this is what happened. It can be 3 banks, it can be 4 banks. These are the examples. Now, a way to do this, right? Again, there are many different ways to do this, right? And the reason of doing this, basically, in the literature that exists, you read what people refer as survival bias. What it means from this case is that if you omit this one, right, we omit this because bank B is no longer exists. It has been merged into bank A, and the name has been called A, for example, right? Because when you merge, the name can be different, or the name can be A, or the name can be combined A or B. But then if you omit this, what you did in terms of this case, subject yourself to survival bias. What it means in this case, the sample that you are in your data set are those who have survived, right? And those who have survived may be those that are efficient, they are good, they have high market share. So you only put in your sample the good banks, and that's what we term as survival bias, right? So as a result, you do not want to omit B, right? You want to omit B. Now, there are 2 ways of doing this also in terms of merger. One, you reconstruct bank A and B. You reconstruct A, right? You reconstruct, right? The measurements for A for 2006 to 2012 by combining, right, the data from A and B for those years, which means you create as if they are one bank. You put together. And then for 2003 and 2009, you just take data from A because these are they have already merged. But before that, combine those data. For example, you combine the financing, you combine the asset, you combine all those things together, right? So you have to reconstruct. And this, what you have to do here is a lot, right? So the normal way, other way that people have done in terms of the second way, right? In terms of this case, right? When they, from this, what people do here in terms of this case, instead of having 2 banks, you have 3 banks. What do you mean in terms of this case? Bank A will run from 2006 to 2012. And you have Bank B will run from 2006 to 2012. And then you have Bank C, when you put in different name, Bank C equal to the merger of A and B. The data will run from 2013 to 2019. Right? So in your data set, instead of having 2 banks, you have 3 banks. Right? That represent Bank A and B before the mergers and Bank C. And this is acceptable. Why? Because in panel data set, the time need not be the same. Right? You have unbalanced panel data sets. Right? Now, number 6, basically, can you compare the IB with the same size of conventional bank? The answer is yes. And in the literature, you type in the literature for examples, right? People refer to this one as matched samples. You use matched sample, right? Matched sample. Some article they use this. But then you have to remember when it comes to matched sample, it's not only size alone that you have to compare. Maybe you have to compare many various aspects, and there are criteria. And that one can be done, right? And in terms of hypothesis, where to put in the hypothesis, right? Now, normally, in the introductions, you have research objective. Research objective is nothing more than indication of hypothesis, right? But then if you want to write hypothesis explicitly, for example, hypothesis number 1, hypothesis number 2, I would suggest you to write the hypothesis together with literature review, right? Because these are the common place that people put the hypothesis: literature review and hypothesis developments, right? In my articles, I put in literature review, which means together with the literature related to your research objective, at the end, you provide basically the hypothesis. So if you want to put hypothesis, put together in there, right? Now, dummy variables, right? When it comes to dummy variables, do we need to provide correlations for dummy variables, right? Now, it's no harm to provide correlations, and no harm also to omit that. Right? But then descriptive statistic must be there, because we would like to know how many fractions, which is our 1, how many percent, which is 0, right? But then you also can put correlations, right? Just no harm there, right? In terms of putting correlations in there, right? Now, how to treat missing value? Missing value. And then the only thing I have to ask, how many observations then are missing? Right? There are a lot, for example, for that particular firm or particular bank, then it's better to omit them, right? And just include only the consecutive years that are not missing, right? So there are many different ways. For example, certain banks, they have data from 2001 up until 2004. They are missing in between. They start having against data from 2010 up to 2019, for example. Now, you have so many missing values here, right? Many years. It's better to drop the early years, just use 2010 and 2019, right? But if, for example, you have from 2001, let's say you want to start from 2001, you have data from 2009, you have missing value only 1 or 2, right? Missing 1 observations or 2. In this case, you can interpolate, which means that you use the average. For example, these are the standard procedures that are in the textbook. Let's say you have 2001, 2002, and then you have 2004, right? But you don't have 2003. 2003 value can be the average of 2002 and 2004, right? So that what can be done in terms of missing value, right? And survey data. Normally, survey data, basically, the first thing that you have to look at, respondent profile. And respondent profile doesn't have to be a descriptive statistic, just how many percent male, how many percent female. That's what you have to put in, right? And the first table may be, people want to know who respond to your data set. What are their income levels, right? How many percent have higher income? How many percent have income lower than this? So those what you have to put in. But when it comes to the instrument or the construct that you have, for example, let's say the measurements you have, right? Let's say you have in there a measure of certain things, right? That one you can present your descriptive statistic and correlation, because that measures are the one that you are going to use for the purpose of your results, right? Now, for the purpose of your analysis. So that's in terms of respondent profile. Doesn't need to be descriptive statistics, right? You just profile how many percent male, how many percent female, how many percent basically the age group, right? From which age group, how many percent of whether they are governments, they are private or self-employed. Those are type of things that you would like to know, right? In the context of respondent profile, right? And as I mentioned, some survey data, as long as you have measurements and you use that measurements that reflect certain variables, right? You can present descriptive statistics. So you may have both respondent profile and descriptive statistics, right? And when it comes to your own measurements, right? Of course, you have to explain them, but then having your own measurements, you must have the reason why, right? You must have some belief that better than the present one. Present one. You must have that belief. Otherwise, why you use different measurements? For example, you are more, let's say, SIRMA, they focus more on the supply side of financial access. And you think that supply side is not enough, you want to go into more micro demand side, right? For example. Or for example, SIRMA use min-max method, but then you think that min-max method is not sufficient to capture. There are certain weaknesses that you have looked at, and that weaknesses is the one that you try to address, and that's why you come up with measurements, right? Of course, you don't use what people have done. You don't use the same method what people have done, but still, it related to what people have done in the sense that you try to improve, and that's why you come up with different measures. And that you have to justify, right? So that's what it means by own measurements. Own measurement will not come out of nothings. What I mean in this case, you must have reasons why you do not use the existing one. You want to use your own measures. Why? Because maybe in the context of Indonesia, these are more reflective of what you try to measure rather than taking whatever has been suggested, which are applied to many other countries. Right? So there must be some reasons. Own measurement, why? There must be some reasons. And mostly the reasons, what you have used here is more reflective, better measures than the existing one. Right? So these are type of things that I can answer with respect to what you have done here. But then we still can communicate. If you have anything else from Nurul, Nadia, Dr. Tika, as well as Pawanto, we can discuss further, but this is my guideline of data point, right, that you have. Okay.
Okay, Prof. Just to continue a little bit, may I, yeah. Prof?
Sure.
On the own measurement, if we already try to form and provide explanation, do we need to also provide references, Prof, where we get the approach, for example, from another literature?
Yeah, can. Yeah. For example, let's say that see, one of my, I think I mentioned before, one of my PhD before, right? Look at financing stability, right? Financing stability, and how this stability affect risk, right? Affect risk. Now, not financial stability, but financing stability, right? So what I asked her basically, why not you go into literature on international trades? Because international trade, they have a measure they call trade instability, right? Where they look at components of export by sectors. And based on that component of export by sectors, they construct various instability index, short-term, medium-term, and long-term, based on the changes in compositions of the exports, right? Which means that your financing will be stable, or the trade will be stable if the composition of export remain the same. But its composition of export is shifting. This year move there, and next year, some other sectors become more exported, for example, oriented and so on. There are structural changes. So that structural instability in there, in terms of export structure. So why not I told her, why not you apply this to the financing structure, because financing can go to different sectors. Or in terms of Islamic, can be in different financial contract. You look at the instability, which means the changes in compositions, right? So it becomes financing composition instability index, and trade Composition Instability Index. So you go to the international literature to borrow the measure that you apply to your financing, right? So that's why also very important for you to read a lot, not just in your area, but some other areas. Maybe you can borrow the measure that they use there, right? And if you look at, for example, economics, use a lot of measures from physics, volatility, right? Even liquidity, for example, a lot of things coming from there, and the wording and so on, right? So the same thing here, right? You have to cite where you use to justify, and more important, why is difference, why is it better than the existing measures? That's more important. And in fact, you can come up with better one. This will serve as your contributions. These are what has been used. So become your contributions, in fact. Right?
Yeah, thank you.
For example, right now, right, I have not yet come up with the measures, but I'm still reading, just to share with all of you. I try to look at the oil market instability, right? The oil market instability, and how it affects the banking sector in the GCC, right? In the GCC. Now, when I measure my oil market stability, for example, right, the problem that I face conceptually right now, because oil market stability is only one measure applied to all banks, because you have only one oil stability index, right? But we know that an increase of oil instability or the level of oil instability, for example, let's say the measure is 50, but to each country there are differences, right? There are differences because Saudi Arabia may be affected more if oil instability increase as compared to some other countries that are less dependent to oil. So how can I construct basically oil stability that are specific to the country, even if the oil index is global index, right? So now I'm reading the literature on exchange rates, right? Where if you look at the exchange rate, for example, for a country, you have only one exchange rate, right? But how to construct exchange rate for each specific sectors that are different across sectors? There are studies that are doing that. So I'm still reading on how they construct. So I can use that idea to construct country-specific oil instability, right? Which I'm not able to construct if I use the global oil index. So that's what I mentioned. You have to read some others in order to construct your measures. But whatever you construct your measures, as I mentioned to you before, take notes of your measurements, because that you have to explain and you have to justify in your writing. Okay. Let's look at the chats, whether we have more.
Thank you.
Okay.
Prof, we have another question.
Okay.
Okay.
The PowerPoint, Nadia, did you receive the PowerPoint last night?
Yes, I have received it, Prof. Okay. From Ibu Tini. Assalamualaikum, Prof. Permitted to ask, when we're collecting data, sometimes in one or several variable the data are incomplete in some time period. Can we interpolate data to make it complete? And can we interpolate data from yearly to monthly or quarterly? Because other variables are in monthly, for example. Thank you, Prof.
The answer yes. As I mentioned before, we are collecting data. Sometimes one or several variables, the data are incomplete, yes, in some time period. But then you have to remember, interpolate cannot be a lot, right? If you have only 1 year, 2 years missing, then you can interpolate. There are many different ways of interpolations, right? So that can be done. I think I have a book on forecasting book where they describe the way to interpolate data. I don't have it with me right now. Then I can search the book during time the break and share with you the book, because they provide methods of interpolating data, right? Now the second one, can we interpolate data from yearly to monthly or a quarterly data set, right? The answer is yes, but then you have to know the approach. Right? There are many different ways of interpolating yearly to monthly, quarterly data. I have never used them, and I will not be able to explain to you what are the methods available out there, but then I have read them. Yes, it can be done, right? In order interpolating yearly to quarterly data sets, right? For example, right, let's say you have GDP, right, which is yearly, and you want to interpolate quarterly. What people do sometimes, they interpolate them on the basis of industrial production index, right? So what they do is basically, right, they take yearly GDP and they take industrial production index, the yearly, they regress them. And on the basis of that coefficient, they predict based on quarterly industrial production index. So there are many different ways that people do that in terms of interpolating, right? And then creating data monthly, quarterly from yearly, right? But then you have to look at what are the benefits of doing those. Right? Because the idea here is this: you do not want to the procedure of creating data through interpolations to affect your results, and that what you do not want to. So you have to think carefully, right? What are the benefits? If you see the benefit to be more than the problem that it brings, then you can do interpolations, right? And from Popinovic, for variable that is new, COVID-19 pandemic perception on giving behavior, where should I put the indicator at the literature review or the method sections, right? Now, I think the literature review is basically, it's not about measurements, right? Measurements. Normally you put measurements in literature review if you have a new measurement that you want to highlight, right? Contribution that you want to highlight, that you have new measurements. Normally you put in data sections and you have to describe how you construct that perception index regarding COVID-19 pandemic perceptions, right? Because some people think like the COVID-19 pandemic is as in other flu, for example. Some people take it seriously. So there are many different perceptions and that affect the behavior. Okay? Now, from Irma, can we separate our data if they have any sources such as from primary data or second data? So I'm not sure that what this means in facts, right? What you mean by correlate our data if they have any sources? I'm not sure the meaning of this. Can you explain a little bit, Irma?
Please, Miss Irma. Where is Irma?
Yes, Miss.
Yes.
Yeah, what do you mean by this? Because you have primary data and you have secondary data. But if they align, it's okay, because for example, you have primary data on firm 1, and then you have secondary data on the same firm, then you can put them together, right? But the fact that they do not align between those two.
Maybe if our variables from any data collection, Prof, maybe we need to primary data like from questionnaire. Are we sure from any respondents? And besides that, we need to use secondary data. So if they have secondary data and primary data, can we collaborate two of this from the data?
Yeah, what do you mean by collaborate?
Our variables is different.
Yeah.
Have different.
Yeah, but then in your article, if you analyze them separately, it's okay. One based on primary to achieve certain objective of your article. Second, the secondary data, that's okay. But when you try to put them together, how do you mesh them? And that one will be a problem, right? right? But then your paper can use both primary and secondary data. It's no problem to put both of them, because sometimes we take survey just to get opinions, and then we get say data to address other related objective, for example, right? So I'm not sure when you say collaborates, what that means. You combine the data together in one data set, and that one, a lot of job you have to do, because primary data to put in secondary data, they must match, right? For example, as I said, if you survey the firm, then secondary data also have to be about that firm. If you survey individuals, secondary data also have to be about that individual. But whether that's possible or not to be done, and that's something that you have to look at, right?
Is it clear, Ms. Irma?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we can test our running data by collaborating primary and secondary, yeah, Prof.
Yeah, you can do. You can, but then have to be done separately if you cannot match the data together, right? Which means those two data sets are used in one article to address related objective, but they are not the same objective, right? Okay. And finally, if the original data in time series has been transformed to the first different and we use the first different, how do we present the descriptive statistic, the original data or transform one, the transform one, right? Because when it comes to interpretations, the transform one that are used in the estimations, right? So that transform one is the one that's basically we report the descriptive statistics, right? But if, for example, there is any, you want to highlight certain thing from the non-transform one, it's no harm to put in. For example, you can put in GDP, right? And then you can put GDP growth. No harm to put both of them. Why you want to highlight the level of GDP per capita, the level of income per capita, for example, before you transform. And that's no harm, right? To put in there, right? But then normally we present the transform one. Why? Because the implications on the result interpretations. People will refer back to whatever you use in the estimations. And if you use in the estimations, the transform one, you should present the descriptive statistic, the transform one, right? So that's my answer to those. So I don't think we have any more, and we take a break for 15 minutes.
10 minutes maybe? Okay.
10 minutes, okay. So we come back 11:35.
Okay. Okay, Prof.
Okay, take a tea and coffee for all of you. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Prof.
Nadia, we can continue.
Yes, Prof. Ladies and gentlemen. Yes, Prof.
Yes, okay.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we will continue with the topic is methodology. Right, Prof?
Yeah. Okay, before I proceed, there is one question here. The data used by the data used by researcher is monthly data, but there is certain variable found is weekly data. What is the weekly data? Sums and average. Now, if you look at data on the variables, right? Normally, when you have weekly data normally refer to asset price data like stock market, exchange rate, interest rates, right? They have weekly data set. Now, you have to look at definition of weekly data set, how they construct the weekly data set, right? How do they construct weekly data set? You have to look at, right? Now, very important, right? Let me highlight in terms of data that you have, right? Let me just provide a little bit of highlight in terms of data point that you have. Now, sometimes your data is very high frequency. Right? Let's say daily. Right? And from daily, for example, how to turn daily into weekly, right? Data sets. And also sometimes you have daily. How to turn this into monthly, for example, data set. When you want to construct the market. And the same thing, right? When you have monthly, right? For example, how to turn this into, let's say, quarterly data set, right? Quarterly data set. Right? And sometimes you have quarterly, how to turn them into yearly data set. So these are very important parts, right, of data construction, because sometimes you have monthly, but your observation are quarterly mostly. So you want to turn monthly into quarterly. So this is the opposite of what has been asked before. Before you ask, you have quarterly data set or yearly data set, you want to turn it to monthly data set, and that requires method for interpolations, right? But the reverse also can be the case. Right? For example, you have daily and become weekly. Now, normally, when it comes to daily, of course, you have, let's say you have Monday, right? You have Monday, you have Tuesday, you have Wednesday, you have Thursday, and you have Friday. Now, when you want to construct weekly from daily data sets, you have to provide criteria, which day that you use to present the weekly data set. Right? As you said, sometimes people use the average. Right? Sometimes people just use, let's say, Wednesday.
Yes.
Right? Why Wednesday? To avoid the day of the week effect if you refer to the stock market, for example. So you have to look at the practice. Right? Now, from daily to monthly data set, for example, you have stock index. Right? Stock index. And you have daily right now, but later on, maybe after 2 or 3 years, you want to use monthly, because now you have enough data for the COVID-19 pandemic, right? How you turn daily into monthly data? You can use average value, right? Average. You can use end of the months, right? So which means that any value at the end of the month will represent monthly data, or you take the average value of daily data on that month to represent monthly data, right? And when you go on monthly to quarterly, quarterly to yearly, you have to look carefully into this case. Why I said you have to look carefully, right? Into this case, you have to look at whether the variable that you use, for example, are stock variables, right? Are stock variables, stock versus flow variables, right? Stock variables are variables that are measured at a given point in time and it represents the stock of something. Flow of variables is the variable that you measure over a period of time. Okay? Very simple. GDP is a flow variable because you measure GDP over 1 quarter, over 1 year. Okay? But then money supply is stock variable because you can stop now. Let's measure the supply right now. What are the stock money supply there? Okay? Your income is flow variable because your income is the earning that you get for a month that you have worked. But your wealth that you have saved is the stock variable. Right? So you have to measure in those things. So this have important implications on converting monthly to quarterly. Right? Because if there are stock variables, right? If there are stock variable, for examples, right? You can use end of the month, right? Or you can use average. Right? For example, let's say you have monthly money supply. Right? Monthly money supply, you have January, right? January figure, February figure, and March. Right? And money supply is stock variables. Right? Stock variables. Or total assets of the bank, for example. Right? Stock variable, because at a given point in time, these are the assets of the bank. So when you want to construct quarterly or yearly, or from quarterly to both way here, right? You may use March to represent quarter one, or you may use the average of these three to represent quarter one, right? But if there are flow variables, right? If there are flow variable, let's say bank income, right? Bank income, flow variables. Right? You cannot use the sums, right? And you cannot use the average when it comes to flow variables. Here, flow variable, you have to use the sum. Right? Because the income of quarter number one will, right? Like our income, for example, what's your income in quarter number one? You cannot say the average of income in January, February, and March. It's wrong, right? That average monthly income. But what are the income, total income in quarter number one? It have to be summations of January income, February income, and March income, right? And you cannot use the end of the month because end of the month just provide you income for March, not for the whole quarter. So you have to look at it for converting what are type of the variables that you have there, right? So sometimes when we convert from high frequency to low frequency, sometimes we use the sum, sometimes we use the average, sometimes we use end of the period, right? Which one need to be used depends on the concept of the variable that you have there. Right? Whether they are flow or they are stocks. So those are things that you have to take heed of in the context of flow and stocks variables, right? Is it necessary to include skewness, kurtosis? The answer is not necessary to include skewness and kurtosis. Skewness and kurtosis only for high frequency data. Let's say you have daily data set and you want to justify why you use, let's say, Gauge modeling, for example. Then you put skewness and kurtosis in there. Okay. Okay. Let's see it to the methods, and then we can open up at the end. On the method. As I mentioned to you, I will not describe into a methods the detail on method itself, right? But more, I would like to center my discussions on how do we write the method sections, right? Now, this in the article, the most easy parts, right? But sometimes as writers, we are confused, right? And we do not write well, even in terms of methods. Why is it easy part? You can pick up any methods. And in fact, if I look at your method you are going to use, many other articles have used them. So the only thing that you need to do in terms of this case is to take those articles, 5 or 6 of them, and look at how they write the methods. And then you can not totally replicate, but then you can learn from their structure and write accordingly, right? And what I'm going to provide to you here, the standard way of writing the methods in most articles. Of course, again, as I mentioned to you, there are many different ways, but I provide you more or less a way of writing the method to those who are the beginners in writing, right? Where you can learn from here. And after, as I always mentions, after you have written 4 or 5 articles, you will develop your own way of writing, right? But for now, we just follow the standard way of writing, right? Now, one thing that you have to be aware, right? The methods that you use, the main purpose of using the methods here is to answer your research objective, to address your research objective, whatever the method that you have, right? Many articles in your group would like to look at the performance of the stock indices, Islamic and conventional, for sectors during the time of crisis, right? Where the crisis is the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the method must address that, must tell exactly how you do that in terms of evaluating the performance as compared to the normal period, right? So, and in fact, there are so many methods out there. And if we try to basically, if we try to catch, right, the methods, for example, right, or try to learn the methods, we may not be able to catch up with the method, because from month to month, day to day, week to weeks, people suggest new methods on how to do things. And these are the work of statisticians and econometricians. There are so many, right, in terms of empirical methods. Then what you have to use here, right, that you have to choose in terms of method before you describe them. Which one do you think is most appropriate and why? Right? You think this is the most appropriate methods to use, right? Most appropriate method to use. And that one really important parts, right? Which one? Of course, you may not sure, 2 or 3, right? Because you read literature, some use this, some use that. What you have to do is just put on the paper, okay, for this topic, there are 3 different methods. Method number 1, method number 2, method number 3, for examples. Right? There are 3 different methods, number 1, number 2, and number 3, right? Now, when you have those 3 different methods, now you have to, in my context, which one is most appropriate and I prefer to start with. Of course, you do not want to omit the other approach too. You just keep that in mind. Because remember, always you have robustness checks, right? I mentioned here, and in fact, I failed to mention here, in this case, right? When you have variable measurements, there are many different ways to measure the variables. Use that many different ways for robustness checks, for example, right? Financial inclusions, there are 2, 3 different ways. You use one way as your preferred one. The other ways can be your robustness checks later on, because you have to strategize on that part. The good article to be appearing in good journal must have thoroughness, which means that you must do robustness checks. The same thing in terms of methods. Which one most appropriate? You may have 1, 2, 3, but must rank which one first that you would like to use, right? As simple as some of you mentioned, you use panel data. As simple as between static panel or traditional panel and dynamic panel. Which one you prefer to use? And of course, you have to answer why you prefer this one. Not just your preference, but you have to answer, right? From statistical point of view, from economic point of view, why you prefer dynamic panel instead of a static panel. You observe people use both, right? So you put them, use both, but I will start with this one first. The other one, maybe I will consider for robustness checks, right? So this is the answer that you have to provide. Which one is most appropriate? Okay. Now, in good journals, right? When it comes to methods, it's not about the most advanced methods, right? you should not write in such a way that you try to impress, I use the most advanced methods, the most recent methods. No, they are not interested in that. They are interested more in the issues. I'm interested in this, why these issues which you have built up in your introductions. The method that you use must be appropriate in addressing that issues. So it's not about most advanced. Of course, if that most advanced method is most appropriate because it addresses certain assumptions of your model specifications, so be it, right? But do not try to impress the readers, right? I use advanced method, GMM is the most advanced, GMM is that, GMM is this, for example, because people are not interested in terms of knowing your ability to use advanced methods. People are interested in looking at your ability to address research objective in the right way. And that's what people are interested in, right? So remember, when it comes to methods, it's not the most advanced method. And the way that we write, we should not impress on the method. We should convince people on the issues and try to tell them that these are the right method that need to be used. If you use simple methods, least square regressions, for example, so what? Have read article in Q1 journal that use least square estimations. Why? Because this is most appropriate in the context, right? In his context, it's the most appropriate for them, right? So those are things that you have to remember. Now, you have to make differentiation between model specifications and model estimations, right? Model specification is the equation that you write, right? That you write. Now, what I'm discussing right now is empirical models where you have the empirical equations. You have equations you want to estimate, right? Either into using, or you have the framework like in concept structure equation modeling that you link the variable, you come up with the correlation between the variable and so on. So you have something that you have to estimate. So you have to specify your models. And the specifications of your model means that you have the functions, right? And normally we use linear functions, linear in parameters functions. That's standard, right? But sometimes in our model specification, we put the square term, we put interaction term, right? We put a dummy variable in there, we put dynamic term in there. So those are specifications where you make y to depends on the lag value of y and so on. So that your model specification, functional form, right? Of course, whatever specification, whatever variable you have included, right? The list of independent variable you must justify, right? Whether you want to have lag dependent variable in your regressions or not, that you have to justify why. And the justification cannot be based on the method. Justification must be based on the theories, right? So you specify your functions, you explain your variables that you put in there, and what assumption that you make, for example, right? Or when you specify your models, right? Any type of assumption that you want to highlight, you have to make it clear in your model specifications, right? So those are the part, right? Now, model estimations, right? Model estimations is different. Given the specification of your models, right? How you would estimate your model. That's the second part. Specification comes first, estimation comes second, right? You do not estimate first, because sometimes people say, okay, I use GMM to estimate the model, but I do not know yet what is the models that you want to estimate and why you use GMM. So you have to specify first before you go to estimation technique. And estimation must address whatever model specifications issues that you have in the context of assumptions. And that one really important part, right? In terms of your estimations procedure, right? So if you look at the way I try to tell you in terms of this case, in terms of this one here is that when you write about the methods, always start with model specifications and explain your model specifications, and then end with model estimations. How would you estimate your models? It's always in that way, right? So you must be separate between those two, right? Now, people used to say to me, for example, let's say, let me put some things here, right? To make it clear what it means by the difference between model specification and model estimations. Right? People use in time series, people used to, because I taught basic econometric before, but also I taught financial econometric as well as advanced econometric. Right? People used to tell me, right, do not use OLS because it's obsolete. Right? But use error correction model. Right? When using time series data. Right? Now, if you look in this case, right, what I try to bring to you here is that the distinction between estimations methods, right, and model specifications is not well understood by someone who say this, right? So the only thing that I asked the person when he said this, I asked, how do you estimate error correction model, which is ECM? How do you estimate error correction model? Right? How do you estimate this? Right? Because someone said this in different class. Basically, someone teach financial econometric and tell the students that forget what you have learned in basic regressions that use the least square because that obsoletes. Here we have to use error correction modeling, right? And students who took class with me came to see me and said, what I have taught them is obsolete. Now we have to use error correction modeling. So I asked them to go back and ask, how do you estimate error correction modeling, right? We estimate using OLS. Right? Now, do you see the difference between those two? Error correction model is model specifications, right? The way you specify the model, where you have the changes in Y, your dependent variable, you regress on the error correction term as well as the changes in some other variable, and you call that model error correction model. Why? Because it's time series modeling, right? And that model specification, but how you estimate that? Yes, you still estimate them using OLS, least square regressions. So there are differences between those two, which mean that the first statement that has been made here is totally wrong, right? Misunderstanding of the estimation methods, right? And model specifications. And most of the time we make these mistakes, especially if we are not well versed with econometric, we make that mistake. But from now on, try to make distinctions. GMM is estimation procedure. Dynamic panel is model specifications. You have to understand between those two. When you have dynamic panel, doesn't mean you have to use GMM. It can be other estimators, right? When you have model specifications. So you have to know your model specifications here, right? And model specification contain three parts: the variable that you put in, the function that you use, and what assumption that you use, right? And as I mentioned, the one that you have to look at, given model specifications, what is most appropriate. And sometimes, again, from your literature review, sometimes you see conflicting practices. People use different model specifications, right? And people use different estimation procedure, right? And that one you can keep in mind after you have chosen, because you have to start with certain things. You have to start with something, but then you have to be always open to robustness checks, right? Now you look at, as of right now, right, when it comes to result, you already have 2 in mind as part of your robustness checks. And in fact, you can have 3 now, right? The one coming from you when you ask me, 1, measurements of the variables. If your key variable are measured differently in the literature, right? The one is your preferred, or the one that you suggest, but then you have to you have to be open of evaluating also based on other way of measuring the variables, right? Second, as you said, outliers, sample constructions. There are many different ways of to construct a sample, whether you want to take outliers out or you want to put outliers in, for example, right? So these are way of, as I mentioned, right, a way of having robustness check. The third one, the estimation procedure. I estimate using, for example, fixed effect. My robustness check may be dynamics, maybe GMM procedures. So these are many different ways that you can do robustness check. Now, see, as I mentioned, if you plan your research design properly, right, you can do a lot of things. You can know from the beginning what you need to do. And that one most important thing to come up with a good articles, having robustness checks and so on, right? And always the conflicting practices should not confuse you in terms of not knowing what to choose. But conflicting practices provide you guideline on how to do robustness checks. The only thing you have to do, start with one approach first, the one that you think most preferred based on your understanding, based on your reading, and reserve the other one for robustness checks, if there are 2 different ways, right? So I have seen many different methods that people use, in fact. Right? My article, for example, that I look at oil price, I use dynamic panel to be my baseline, and I use panel vector autoregression to be robustness checks, alternative method of doing things, right? And a lot of things you can observe. Sometimes people start with dynamic panel and they use fixed effect as robustness check. Sometimes people start with fixed effect, they use dynamic panel as robustness check. Always open up. And the same thing in any other areas. I think when it comes to survey data, you know more about the approach. There may be many different ways of constructing your framework, right? So because articles out there provide you guideline, and they come up with difference in terms of constructing the framework, you can use one instead of the other. But then the other one, you can always use as robustness checks. And that one very important part in terms of writing empirical methods, right? And later on, I will show you the same article there and try to look at how simple we write the empirical methods. It's not something difficult, unless you design your own method and you try to explain a lot of things, right? But then normally they follow very standard procedures, right? If you have more equations, you can just explain what are the more equations that you have and so on, right? So those are type of things that I would like to highlight in terms of the method. And again, I have to emphasize when we write the methods, the main points of writing the methods is to make it to be for others to be able to replicate what you do. Right? You have to be that clear, right? And then you have to demonstrate the fact that you understand the methods, because sometimes people put the methods in, people do not really understand the method that they put in. Why? Because they learn the methods by learning the software, right? And they do not know the idea that behind those methods, right? So that's why when it comes to empirical method, the training has to be separate, right? Have to be separate. And hopefully I will write the guideline on the methods later on. Normally my area is using both time series and panel data, and I have written certain guidelines on various type of method that can be used, which is enough to write an articles, right? Like panel VR, right? Dynamic panel, heterogeneous panels, right? And how to interpret the result and so on would be enough for you to write an articles. So these are type of things that I try to contribute into a method, but cannot be done here in our case, right? Now, given model specifications, right? Now, what is most appropriate, right? Of course, as I said, that's what you have to answer. So let me, because many articles or many of you are going to use panel data, So let me give you this guideline here. Just write a very simple way. Let's say you have your dependent variable where your dependent variable is quantitative variables, right? And then there's continuous variable like bank profitability, banks economic growth. Some of you try to look at economic growth, right? Poverty, some of you try to look at poverty and so on, right? So now you have the variable, your dependent variable to be quantitative. Now, you have to put in, okay? These are the understanding that you must have into our methods, right? The first one, what structure of data that you have? You have to ask yourself, what are structure of data? And that's why the first thing I have mentioned when it comes to data, what is the structure of your data sets? Right? It can be three, right? Either cross-sectional data sets, time series data sets, and panel data set. You have three structure of your data set. Right? You have cross-sectional data set. One way of doing it basically would be to rely on classical regressions, but then again, depends on the way you specify the models and your assumption that you have made, right? And if you have time series data sets, you may have to go to time series models, depending on what time series model that you would like to use, right? Do you want to go into basically looking at the long run relationship between the variable, short run dynamic interactions? Do you want to look at causality? You want to allow for the gas effect? So those are many different ways that you can address in context of time series. Do you like to use Markov switching time series also that allow your coefficient to depend on? So these are many different things. Which one that you use must capture or must address your research objective, right? So I just give you some point here of the methods that are available out there, right? Let's say your answer here, okay, I'm going to use panel data set. Okay? Panel data set. These are the choice of method that you would like to use, right? To start with, as I said, to start with, right? Because you have to begin with one specifications and one method, and then you have to modify your equation accordingly, right? For robustness checks or for additional objective that you might have. But normally you start first with a basics model to address your research objective, right? So let's say what you have here is panel data set. The next thing that you might want to ask is your panel structure micro or macro? Right? Now, what do you mean by micro and macro, right? The macro means normally the time frames, the time is large, right? Time spans is large, right? You have more than 20 years of data, right, for many countries. And normally classed by T, more than N, right? Where N is the number of cross-sectional units, right? Let's say, look at some studies have looked, you use 30 years of data for, let's say, ASEAN +3, right? So you have ASEAN 5 +3. So you put, let's say, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, and you +3. What are those three? Japan, China, and Korea. For example, you have 8 countries, right? And for each one of them, you have 30 years. And this is what we term as macro panels, right? Macro panel. And that is data structure. And when you have macro panels, then your approach is different as compared to micro panels, right? Where your micro panel is here. Micro panels, normally, a micro panel refer to data structure where the N is normally less than 10, right? Will not be more than 30, right? More than 20, normally. Right? Will not be more than 20. And N is substantially larger than T, right? For example, you have 10 years of data. T is less than 10, will not be more than 20, and N is substantially more than T. Now, for you, what you have done, for example, you have n bank, number of bank, for example, M is basically number of bank, your sample. It's like you have 30 bank. This is not big. Some people have used 10,000 bank, more than 10,000 bank, for example. Some people have used huge data sets, more than hundreds, thousands of banks, right? So N is big. This is what we term as micro panels, right? So these are the structure of your panel data sets. Of course, if you have anything to ask later on regarding time series and classical regressions, we'll be happy to explain. But just to explain to you, the process for you to arrive at model specifications, right? Forget about estimation yet, just model specification first here. How you specify your equations in terms of panel setting, right? And sometimes, unfortunately, we are not so clear, right? We are not so clear. It can be micro, it can be macro. Why? Because T and N more or less the same, for example. You cannot treat as micro. Why? Because N is small, not big. And you cannot treat it macro because T is not big. It's moderate size, like 17. You are not sure of which one, right? So all of these things are something that you have to look at when you try to design the methods, right? Before you write the method. So these are something that you have to look at before you design the methods. Now, the next one, let's say your data is micro panel. The next thing that you have to ask, does your dependent variable exhibit persistence? Which means that this is the behavior your dependent variables tend to depend on the past behavior, right? If you look at, there are many, for example, variables that depends on the past. Our consumption behavior, for example, we look at consumption behavior. Consumption behavior is something dependent on the past because consumption is built through habits. What we consumed last year tend to also explain what we plan to consume this year, right? So those are consumptions, right, for everyone. So this need to explain through theory, not just simply, okay, I make my dependent variable to be persistent because I want to use GMM, right? Now, do not think about estimation procedure yet at this point. Think on how, from the theories, you want to specify your empirical models. These are from theory to empirical models, right? So is there any dynamic in your models? And again, where's the guideline? Your literature review, right? And of course, in your literature review, as I mentioned, for example, some will use dynamic, some use static, but then you have to make assessment from your own point of view, based on the theories that you understand, whether the variable exhibit persistence or not, right? Which means that that variable depends on its past value, that you have to make your own judgments and come up with your own choice. If yes, then your model specification will become dynamic panels, right? If no, your model specification become static panels. Whichever case that you have to go to the next step of model specifications. What independent variable that you would like to include in your models, right? Independent variables that you would like to include in your models. And then you have to do further specification in terms of assumptions. What assumption that you would like to make with respect to the error terms and many other assumptions that are relevant to your model specifications. So those are type of things that you have to put in, right? And at this point, what you arrive at would be your empirical models, the starting point. Before you modify, before you make extension to address other objective or for robustness checks. You have to start with certain point, right? See, you always have to start. In this case, statistics has more or less quite objective step. in terms of come up with the procedures. And that's why I said this section is easier. The only thing you have to make a choice because there are many methods available out there, right? But in terms of going through and pick which model is most appropriate, for example, you can ask, right? With respect to theories, with respect to studies, you are going to end up with one specific specifications. The concept of micro panel, you may end up with dynamic panels, or you may end up with static panel, either one of them. That's what you have to do, right? When it comes to time series, many different questions you might have to ask, right? When it comes to classical regressions, different questions that you have to ask. At the end, you would like to have your model specifications. So that's what you need in the context of model specifications. Now, once you have decided your model specifications, right? Once you have decided your model specifications, now, what you do next, right? Now, see, the thing that you have to do in terms of this case, right? As I mentioned, right? There are a lot of things going on right now, right, when we do research. We choose one specifications or one model, but then we have in our mind many other different type of specifications, many different type of models, many different samples that can be constructed, many different measurements of the variables, many different period that you have. So there are a lot of variations in there, right? But then if you are systematic, you can see in terms of what you need to do in order to complete your work, right? But then, as I mentioned, the starting point, you have to choose your model first. Justify as much as you can why you start in this way, or why you start the model the way you start, or the model that you have chosen. And that one, really important point, right? And this slide, just to give you some idea, right? How the data structure, right? And affect the way that you specify your models, and how the theory itself, for example, let's say whether the variable exhibit persistent or not, affect your model specifications, and then how the theories also affect what control variables that need to be incorporated in. So those are type of things that basically will dictate or will guide you on model specifications, right? And that the choice that need to be made, right? That need to be made, right? So I view that almost most of you, I think 80% will use regression analysis. Some of you will use structure equation modeling, and some of you will use maybe some other method, but then most of you will use econometric modeling, regression analysis. So which means that the first thing that you have to come up with an equations to address your research objective. And that equation require proper specifications, and that specifications will be based on theories, right? And also the studies that you have read in your literature review. And that's what need to be done, right? And now, right, when it comes to this, right, model specification and so on, in terms of writing, how do we write? Writing is so simple in terms of model specifications. I never deviate away from this type of writing because it's quite standard in all articles, right? And these are the most simple way on how to write when it comes to methods. And of course, as I mentioned, to write, we have to properly understand the method so that we do not say things that are wrong with respect to the method, because sometimes people give a wrong explanation of the methods. You have to understand the method themselves, right? Now, this is the way that I write, right? Regarding the methods, right? Always remember, right? This is what I put in. Always remember, when you write the empirical method, must be explained in such a way that they can be replicated by other scholars. If, for example, you write the articles, and I'm the referee of your articles, right? When I read your description of the methods, of course, the detail must be right. The way you describe the method must be right, right? But then the way you explain must be clear in a way that if I myself would like to do it, I can replicate easily, right? So that clarity must be in there, right? And remember, most methods that we use are most likely standard, which means that always good to refer to previous studies that people have done, for example, right? And follow those studies on how they describe the methods, right? Now, normally we begin with model specification first when we explain, right? Model specification first. Now, it's not difficult, right? I will show the examples, right, after this in terms of what I mean by begin with model specification first, and then explain your models. Right? When I say explain your model, it explains why you specify the model as such. If you use dynamic Y, you use static Y. In times is why you put all these variables together, for example, in one equations. Right? Explain it. Explains how key objective addressed based on that baseline. What are the key variables, key parameters in that model that would answer your research objective? Explain the expected relations, right? Expected relations, which means that what are the relationships you expected between your dependent variable and your key variables, as well as your control variables, and always refer to previous studies, right? You can refer to previous studies that has been done, right? Which means that you choose this to be part, why you choose them, and so on, right? If you have not explained yet in terms of data up there, the one that we have discussed before, right? If you have explained, already explained why you choose those variables to be in your analysis, then you don't have to have this part. You need to explain only the expected relations, right? And now, once you have this, right, you have to keep in mind the alternative assumptions, the alternative models that you might have, because you may need to explain further. Right? For example, based on the above regression, you can say, for example, treat the impact of the oil price on inflation in a linear manner, meaning that the increase in oil price and the reduction in oil price will result in the changes in inflation, right, by the same magnitudes. However, let's say you say that the increase in oil price may result in the increase in inflation, but the reduction in oil price may not necessarily result in the drop in inflation due to certain effects, right? Due to the stickiness of prices in downward directions. If you look in that context, what that means, the result is asymmetric. So which means that the model that you have before, say symmetric impact for the oil price to go up and down, but then you want to incorporate asymmetry. Now you can expand further, right? The alternative model that you use or the extension of your model, and then explains the new model and how they address the other objective that you might have, which in that context, asymmetric relation between oil price and inflation. So those are type of things that you have to explain, but you start with model specification first. And once you have explained your models here, right? Once you have explained your models here, the next step you mentioned, how you estimate them, right? Which estimation method that you have adopted? Do you use least square regression? You use generalized least square? You use GMM, or you use fixed effects, or you use basically threshold regressions? So all type of those things you have to explain, right? Your estimation methods and assumption that come up with the estimation method, and justify a little bit why this method is appropriate, okay? Why this method for you is better than alternative methods, right? So those are type of things that you look at. So these are the starting point, estimation procedures, but as always, keep in mind, there may be alternative assumptions. They may be, say, persistent, dynamic, but someone else may not agree with you. Someone say maybe static, for example, that the alternative assumption, keep that in mind, because this one can become your robustness checks. And sometimes you have to explain the steps, okay? Especially in time series. You have to explain. You express the variables. You said y is a function of this, and you said this in the time series context reflect the long run equations, right? Or the co-integrating equations. In order to and you say that apart from these long run equations, you also are interested in short run dynamics, which are specified as follows. And then you have to explain the step. What you need to do in order to come up with your model specifications, you have to go to step by step, which means that you start with, you explain, you conduct first unit root test, then co-integration test, and so on. So these are the steps that you have to do. Sometimes you have to describe, right? And sometimes you just say, you adopt these estimation methods. Why you adopt these estimation methods, right? Because these estimation methods is most appropriate, better than any other method. But then you still keep in mind of alternative methods for robustness checks. So these are very simple, as I mentioned, very simple, straightforward way of writing on the methods, right? And as I said, method is the most easy to write, right? The most easy to write. And in your case, for examples, right? You have assignments, you have the next task, right? And your next task, basically, of course, this task will be tied directly to your empirical result later on, right? Very important. So you have to think in advance here, how you want to present your result. And the way you explain here must be tied in parallel with the way that you want to present your result later on, right? But then this will be the task that you have to do, which means that you have to do section 3, where in section 3 you have data sections and method sections, and you have to describe both of them, right? In a very simple way. And I would say that these are simpler than the writing introduction, a lot simpler than writing introductions. And these are the guideline of the way that we write estimation methods, right? Now, before I give you the examples, right? Before I give you the examples, the full example, bring back the articles that I have just put in there, right? Let me put here one article of mine that I put. You look at when it comes to describing the methods, it's very easy. Right? The way I put in, building on the bank level studies, particularly on building on the work that has been done by these tools. I refer to the previous studies, right? Because always you are not coming up with something new. Right? The methods have already been used, but then you look at the article that has been done before. You try to be close as much as you try to identify those articles that are close to you, and then you say building on the bank study that has been done before. We start with the following dynamic panel models. And so I specify my models. I explain my model specifications. I explain the extensions of my first models, and then I end up with explaining estimations procedures. Right? And at paper number 13, they try to look at COVID-19 and Islamic and conventional bank performance, for example. Right? You can say, in order to assess the impacts of COVID-19 on Islamic and conventional bank performance, we specify the following regressions, or we specify the following panel model, for example. Those are type of things that you can say. Really simple. You don't have to try to explain long. Just start right away with model specifications. Try to be brief, right? Unless you have something that you have to highlight first before you specify your models. But mostly you can start direct and say, for example, in order to assess. Now, write your models, explain your model. Is there any other models that you want to tell? Address many different objectives that you might have in your estimation methods. And then provide estimations procedures, right? So you look at quite direct in terms of writing method, very easy, right? The only thing that you should not make a mistakes here, but this one's okay because someone will, once you complete your articles, hopefully I can give feedback whether there are major flaw in the write-up or not, right? And that one can be can be rectified before you send to the journals and so on, right? Because I do not want you to have major flaw. Because when you write, see, the referees would like to see based on your writing, whether you know the stuff or not. That's really important part. If you write wrongly, they may come up with a conclusion that you do not know the stuff. And while you do not know the stuff, they may not want to accept your articles. And that's why we have to be right, or we have to be correct in our writing of the methods. Because method is a little bit technical, require understanding, and which we basically different workshop to go through method by methods, right? It cannot be done in terms of writing. And that's why I just refer you a little bit in the context of various type of modeling that are available. Time series, you have basically error correction modeling, vector autoregressions, structural VAR, right? And you have gauge and arch and gauge modeling. You have Markov switchings, right? So those are some methods in time series. And now you have multiple gauge, for example, right? So there are so many different methods that sometimes, right, we may not be able to learn all of those things, but then get a hold of some methods so that we can apply them in our investigations, right? Panel data themselves, right? They have basically the static panel estimated using fixed effect, random effect, instrumental variable estimation, which is two-stage least square, and many other estimators. So many different type of estimators. I can list you easily here more than 10, but there are more, right? Panel corrected standard errors estimators, Driscoll and Cray estimators, Hausman-Taylor estimators. So many estimators available out there. We have to know the detail of those methods, right? Very important part, right? Just to tell you, these are various type of methods. The most important that I try to impress you here, which one that you should choose. And I provide some guideline in there, right? The one that address your objective, that fit into the structure of your data, the model that you have specified, right? So that method that you need to use and explain them would be easier. Now, of course, you can explain how you perform robustness check using alternative methods in your estimations, right? So these are two examples that you can put in effects. Okay? Let me share with you the articles that I just shared with you previously. Let me share with you the articles that I shared you previously. Article number 4 here. Okay? Now, I just want to see, there are many articles. This one have methods. See, very straight and direct. Because remember, article doesn't want you to go long and unnecessarily write on certain things that are not needed. You go direct here, right? Examine the impact of bank competition on bank risk-taking behavior. We follow Sudarmono. Sudarmono is Indonesian researchers, right? Becks, right? And others and so on, who argue that instead of a dynamic model should be used to estimate the time persistence in the bank risk. See, capture bank persistence. Okay? So they use dynamic linear model where risk depend on this, and then they explain one by one what are those variables and so on, and they justify in terms of estimation procedures. See, model specifications come first. Have model specifications here. Very simple. Now, in this case, if you look, they do not need to go into detail. Why? Because the variable has been described before. They just mentioned that, why they put in there, and so on, right? In order to address the research objective. Right? And then when you look at, they discuss a little bit in terms of the estimation procedure. Well as random effect, fixed effect, and try to justify which estimates that need to be used, right? And they describe a little bit. You can say directly which one you pick, right? And which one you pick first and justify, here they describe first various methods that they use, and then at the end they come up with the conclusions that they prefer to use system GMF, for example. So that's the descriptions or the write-up of the methods. It doesn't have to be long when you use panel data, for example. When you use time series data, maybe a little bit longer because you have to describe the steps, right? Your unit root test that you have done, co-integration, what type of co-integration test that you have done, you may describe a little bit, right?